This story about an incredible wizard began right in the middle of the apocalypse, in a world where human corpses filled the cities. Our protagonist sat in the middle of all this chaos, lighting a twig using his finger as a lighter. At that moment, a charred man approached him and tried to threaten him through a cough, saying that he would pay for everything. He rushed towards the cowboy with a knife in his hands, trying to shout something to him, but his terrible condition did not allow him to speak normally. At that moment, the man rose from his seat and, without turning to him, said that his courage was very commendable. After that, he turned sharply and pointed his index finger at him, a spark appearing at the end of it, as if he was getting ready to shoot. And so it was. He used his hand like a gun, and a lightning-fast bullet flew out and pierced the body of the charred man. Finally, the protagonist asked him to convey to Hell that it was John Sutton who sent him there. After some time, things calmed down. But soon John received a letter stating that he had been dismissed from the Imperial Army. Now in his hands, he held a decree that he was now the owner of the Burrows farm. And now, according to the assignment, he had to talk to the headman. At that moment, the main character was driving past a ruined shack in which something unusual was shining, but he was busy reading. As it turned out, a man with a crossbow had been waiting for him all this time, waiting for the right moment to shoot. As soon as John passed by, he immediately pulled the trigger and fired an arrow in his direction. John didn't expect such a vile attack, but the arrow didn't hit him. Instead, it pierced his decree. After this, the man with the crossbow came out and said that bandits were not welcome in this city, and ordered John to stay put. He didn't even suspect that at that moment the main character was preparing a spell in his hand, so that the man couldn't see it. However, he then abruptly extinguished the fire and raised his hands above his head, saying that the man most likely confused him with someone else. He said his name was John Sutton, and the village headman was already waiting for him, as he had been granted the lands of Burrows by order of the Eternal Flame. At this moment, the man with the crossbow frowned. He understood that only the Emperor could give such orders, and this was a bold statement. The man realized that this John was most likely a hero of some war, so he apologized to him for the cold reception. Then he pointed in the direction where the village of Fairford was. He said that the headman lived in the first big house. It was impossible to miss him. The protagonist then took off his hat and thanked the man, who introduced himself as Sheriff George. After this, the men shook hands, and John expressed the hope that they would meet again in the future. However, the sheriff himself did not share his wishes. He hoped that he would never see this man again. Soon after, the protagonist arrived in a city, in the very center of which stood a huge statue of a man. He rode past her on his horse and looked around suspiciously, as this place was unfamiliar to him. He realized that the statue was erected in honor of the very guy he was looking for, who apparently had a huge ego. As the protagonist drove along the road, local residents kept casting sidelong glances at him, and silence reigned throughout the street. After some time, John drove up to a huge, rich building, where the headman should have been located. The men met, and the first thing the headman noticed was that there was a huge hole in the sheet of paper with the resolution. However, even so, it was clear to him that this was an act awarding John a farm with the stamp of the Eternal Flame, something that was rare to see. John added that he was awarded 25 acres of fields, 100 acres of woods, 3 pastures, a house, a barn, 6 cows, and 1 bull. He also said that he encountered some rather difficult people along the way, but the headman said that he would quickly get used to it. After this, the man extended his hand to John and introduced himself as Jonas Halden, or simply Jonas. The protagonist shook his hand, but still noticed that he didn't look much like his statue standing in the middle of the city. And then Jonas explained that the statue was erected in honor of his father. He passed away a few years ago, and they had the same name. He was a veteran of the Wizarding Wars, and John, Jonas assumed, was one too. He then asked the hero if he really wanted this property, since he could have placed him in a safer village nearby. But John still resolutely stated that he was confident in his abilities and that he could handle it. Apparently Jonas didn't like this answer very much, but since John insisted, he suggested that he go and get settled. As they rode together on horseback to the farm, John asked him how Jonas's father became the village headman. He explained that he had served in the army as an advanced scout and had managed to live long enough to retire after the Battle of Torrens Plains. However, the hero stated that no one could survive on the plains of Torrens. 10,000 soldiers died in an instant, and the land was still dead due to spells. Jonas said his father told him they encountered a magician who controlled water and awakened a wave that crashed down on them. However, the father pretended to be dead and swam to safety. But in the end, he was the first to die in the city under strange circumstances. John noted that his father was lucky to live a long life, because in those days, literally everyone was called up for war. Soon they reached the desired place, and the main character hoped that his farm would turn out to be quite good. But the first thing the men saw when they arrived was a small crowd of people near the farm. Judging by the headman's frightened expression, he knew that something strange was going on here. As it turned out, 3 men surrounded the girl with the child and threatened her. talking about some kind of wolf king. As soon as the headman saw a girl he knew named Ellie, he immediately jumped off his horse and ran towards her. He asked her if she was being threatened again, while the men continued to mock and talk about some kind of proposal. One of them, hearing the headman's question, leaned towards Ellie and asked if she had really been threatened, and if she felt in danger. However, the girl firmly stated that she was most likely simply sick of it all. Jonas immediately stood up for her, ordering the men to leave Ellie and the child immediately. But the men were clearly not happy with the headman. They said that he was always stuck up about his daddy's victories and didn't deserve his title. And then John himself intervened in the conversation. He asked the men what they were doing on his territory. One of them just chuckled and said that they were just sorting out a couple of issues here. But the hero declared that they had 2 seconds to resolve their issues elsewhere. Otherwise, he would put their corpses on public display. He then turned to the woman and asked if she had any problems. In response, Ellie only looked at him timidly and said that everything was fine with her. Having received this answer, John turned around and said that in that case they could finish the conversation here, while he unloaded his things and looked around. Everyone present looked after him in surprise, not understanding why this man declared that this was now his property. As soon as the main character entered the barn, he immediately shouted with displeasure and asked where his cow was. The 3 men who were apparently involved in this just snorted in displeasure. And at that moment, the boy who was standing next to Ellie said that these men stole their cows last week, and yet he and his sister took care of them. However, Ellie immediately covered his mouth with her hand and did not let him finish his thought. But the boy's story still caught John's attention, so he looked at the men with displeasure. He approached them and demanded an explanation of what exactly the boy was talking about. The girl immediately stood up for him and said that it was nothing, and asked him not to hold a grudge against his brother. One of the men tried to resolve the conflict and said that the children really loved to make up various stories. However, John looked at him firmly and stated that he had heard the boy clearly enough. He asked the scoundrel what he had done with his cows, but the man still tried to pretend that he knew nothing about it. However, the man's words did not convince the hero at all, so he grabbed his hand. He squeezed his palm with such force that the man screamed in pain and doubled over. After this, he fell to his knees and looked in horror at his hand, all of the fingers of which were broken. Then John leaned towards his ear and whispered that he demanded the immediate return of his cows to the farm. He stated that he gave only 3 days for this. When the men left the farm, the protagonist entered the house, and soon Ellie and her brother Ben appeared on the threshold. The boy was very afraid that the man would force them to leave. He said that they could not allow him to take their house, because they would have nowhere to go. However, the girl still calmed him down and told him not to be nervous. She didn't know anything yet, but she was sure that they would cope and everything would be fine. However, Ben was very afraid of the possible consequences. He did not want to stay with Jonas, but said that this man was some kind of soldier. At this moment, the main character heard their conversation and called the girl to him. She turned around a little surprised, as she didn't expect the man to call her and tell her her name. John then asked why they had settled in this place at all, even in such a difficult situation, and noted that he had not mentioned her name and thought the house was empty. Then the girl explained that Burroughs had actually died, and someone had to take care of the farm, which was why they had come here. Jonas took pity on them, considering that half the city had been destroyed by the Leperian Empire. When the main character heard the name of his empire, he was a little surprised because he didn't believe it. But he still decided not to continue this thought, so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicions. When he looked at the candle that stood in front of him, events that happened in the past flashed in his memory. He remembered standing in the middle of the scorched earth, which was filled with the corpses of unfortunate people. As it turned out, Ellie was nearby that day. She managed to hide and only watched in horror as people died around her. She couldn't even imagine that the man she saw then was now sitting in front of her at the table. At that moment, John blew out the candle and rose from his seat. He then headed towards the kitchen, deliberately turning away from Ellie and Ben. He said he was very sorry to hear this, and offered the girl a hotel stay. He said he had spoken to Jonas about finding her another place to settle, but he wanted to keep the cows and the bull for himself. But Ellie was adamant that this place belonged to him. She had seen the seal, and could not ignore the order of the Eternal Flame. She stated that it was she and Ben who had to leave, since as long as they stayed there, the bandits would continue to bother them. However, John suggested that they stay overnight and think everything over carefully, since he understood how unexpected what was happening was. At that moment, Ellie calmed down and realized that it had been a smart decision. Meanwhile, the dish John was preparing was almost ready, so he asked Ellie and Ben not to be shy and come inside to have dinner together. Soon they sat down at the table, and the main character served them plates of food. Ben was incredibly happy that he could finally eat. Then they began to eat, and while John and Ellie ate their portions calmly, Ben ate as if he had not eaten for a whole week. He ate every last drop, said it was very tasty, and asked where John learned to cook so well. But he indifferently replied that he had learned this from various books. Ben noticed that the man was holding a book called How to Run a House, and this piqued his interest. He was surprised that John didn't know how to take care of a farm, but he bought it anyway, because even a child understood how it was done. However, John did not understand his concerns. In his opinion, serving in the army was much more difficult than looking after the farm. Then Ben jumped out of his seat and began asking John what kind of soldier he was. The hero explained that he was a soldier who lived long enough to retire, and asked Ben where he learned to read. The boy explained that his sister Ellie loved books and taught him to read, but he himself did not like this activity, considering it a waste of time. John noted that the girl's skills were impressive, but she said that her grandmother, who was an extraordinary woman, taught her everything. John didn't ask any further questions and only noted that everyone had secrets. While he went away to wash the dishes, Ellie said that she really missed the smell of a good book. However, they were short of money, so new books were out of the question. Soon after John washed the dishes, he said that his journey had been long, and so he was going to bed. When night came, he was already lying on the bed, but he could not sleep. The same thing happened to Ellie. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The protagonist didn't know what to think about allowing these people to stay here. Ellie was worried that this man might not be who he claimed to be, and his friendliness seemed suspicious to her. The hero no longer considered these people dangerous, but he assumed that they could be thieves or spies. Ellie was worried about the document with the eternal flame seal, since such papers were not issued to ordinary soldiers. So both John and Ellie simultaneously came to the conclusion that their lives were in danger. The girl got out of bed, deciding to check what this strange man was doing at that moment. However, as she stood up, she did not notice how her younger brother fell out of bed and hit his back hard. Meanwhile, John did the same thing. He walked down the corridor with a candle, and hearing a strange sound, stopped. While he was listening, he accidentally stepped on a floorboard, which creaked loudly. Ellie heard this sound and realized that the man had apparently already begun to act. They both walked towards each other's rooms, holding candles in their hands, and did not even suspect that they would collide. As soon as they reached the corner, they both stopped abruptly, as they did not expect to see each other there in the middle of the night. They said they both heard a noise and decided to check if everything was okay. At this moment, both John and Ellie froze, as they clearly did not expect such a turn of events. Without answering each other, they nevertheless said goodbye, and each of them went to their own rooms. No matter how hard Ellie tried to think about her own things, the fatigue still proved stronger, and so she soon fell asleep. The main character also fell asleep, but nightmares prevented him from sleeping normally. He kept remembering that day when he incinerated hundreds of people with the fire from his palm. At some point, he suddenly opened his eyes, feeling something very strange. When John looked up, he saw a message saying he had been awarded 1 doom point and the apocalypse was approaching. When morning came, Ellie went to the kitchen to do some cooking. There she sliced bread to make sandwiches. However, the girl suddenly noticed something strange. When she looked at the pieces of cheese and lettuce, she seemed to see a strange green light emanating from them. She then picked up the egg to begin cooking it, but suddenly felt that her hand was shaking violently. The next moment she began to cough violently, and her whole body was struck by a violent tremor. But she was distracted from her thoughts by the voice of the main character, who had already woken up and wished her good morning. He was surprised that Ellie was in the kitchen at such an early hour. The girl turned around and, without showing it, also wished him good morning. At that moment, Ben ran into the room, almost knocking John off his feet, and he asked his sister what she was cooking. The girl said that it was just leftover food from the garden, and that they were not alone, so she thought it was worth cooking something useful. However, John noted that she looked like she was unwell and offered to help, but the girl said that she was fine. She explained that she had an illness that periodically flared up terribly, and asked John not to pay attention to it. The man then said that there was also food in the pantry, and she could use his food if she wanted. But Ellie said that it wasn't worth doing, and that she had already managed to gather enough food from the garden. John looked closely at the plate of food, which contained 2 slices of bread, 2 fried eggs, a leaf of lettuce, and some cheese. After that, he looked up at Ellie and looked at her questioningly. The girl involuntarily swallowed with fear, but said nothing. After that, they started eating. Ellie invited the hero to look around the farm with her. The area was quite large, and she would be happy to show and tell him everything. Ben noted that he really wanted to feed John's horse. The main character was very happy with this offer, and therefore agreed without thinking twice. After that, he headed to the sink to wash his plate, while thinking about something in his head. Sometime after this, the 3 of them went outside to look at the barn. When they got inside, they realized that the barn was in pretty bad shape, with boards missing in many places. Ellie said they kept wanting to fix the hole in the roof, but unfortunately they had too many other things to worry about. Then the main character suggested that there used to be cows in these pens. The girl confirmed this, saying that they had indeed been there before Whale took them, and that the cows were grazing in the pastures. They also had a vegetable garden near the barn, but they expanded it when the bull was stolen, and again when these men showed up yesterday. The girl said that their bull used to live in a distant pasture, and she invited John to come with her to show him the place. Then they went outside again, and the girl showed him a place that used to be a vegetable garden. Here they had everything they could grow with their own hands, but the harvest here was never very plentiful. In such times, everyone experienced hunger. But the magical wars did not affect this place. But still, spells poisoned the lands. John asked when the pastures had last been cultivated, and Ellie replied that it had been 3 years ago and that they had been idle since then. They wanted to plow them, but in the end they couldn't find anyone who could pull the plow. Then she looked at the protagonist with hope and asked him to take care of everything here. After that, they headed towards the house, and Ellie said that they needed a couple of hours, and by noon they would be able to leave here. However, judging by their behavior and intonation, neither Ellie nor Ben were happy about having to leave the farm. The main character watched them silently. He understood their mood. However, all this seemed wrong to him. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with displeasure and sighed. He then turned to Ellie and Ben as they walked away and asked them to stop. The boys immediately turned around, not expecting the man to ask them to stop. Then John said that they would need a new plow to work here. Ellie said that they could help him with this in the city, but the man explained that this was not what he was talking about. He said he hadn't really figured out the whole thing yet, but they seemed to be taking great care of the place. So he offered to let them stay and help with the work in return, and Ellie said she needed to think about it for a bit. However, her brother already thought that she had agreed, and stated that he was very glad that he could feed John's horse every day. The girl looked at him and understood that she could not refuse, since it would greatly upset Ben. So she, although reluctantly, agreed to help if John would protect them from the Wolf King and his bandits. Then they would stay. The main character liked this proposal, so he agreed quite quickly. Then he asked the girl and her brother to go with him to the city to get some kind of plow there. But as soon as Ellie and Ben heard that they would go to the city, they suddenly stopped and hesitated. John immediately stopped, looked at the boys in surprise, and asked why they had been standing in one place for so long. Ellie explained that there had been several unpleasant incidents there recently, so they tried to avoid visiting the city. Ben immediately cried out that very terrible, strange, and brutal murders were taking place there, and that bodies were found there, twisted into a bundle, or those whose heads had been completely cut off. The protagonist was not very convinced by these arguments, judging by his facial expression. The boy then added that the townspeople thought that this was the work of a witch or a magician. Ellie added that the locals weren't very welcoming to them. They didn't even have a class, but for some reason they thought there was something wrong with Ellie. However, the girl immediately shut her brother's mouth so that he could not continue speaking. But John had already heard something he shouldn't have, and it made him frown with displeasure. So he said that they would take care of the bows later. And since they were staying here, they needed to get some food. Ellie and her brother were very glad that he still allowed them to stay and not go to the city. After this, the main character headed into the forest, where for some time he simply walked mindlessly between the trees. However, suddenly his eyes lit up with flames, and he felt that there was much more mana here. Another moment passed, and he was already surrounded by fireballs and tongues of flame. He raised his hands and completely felt all the mana that was in this place. At some point, veins appeared on his hands, and his eyes lit up with hellish fire, as if he had become a demon. The mana here was so pure that he knew he could easily restore all of his without any extra effort. John noted that it was nothing like those war-torn wastelands. When he looked through the bushes, he discovered that a young deer was walking in a clearing nearby. Without thinking twice, the main character immediately rushed at him from the bushes, while the unfortunate animal did not suspect anything. John was very pleased to find this deer, as it would make an excellent dinner for them. In an instant, he simply incinerated the unfortunate animal, and it collapsed to the ground. The protagonist understood that the eternal flame would do nothing about it, since he himself was a 99th level mage. Soon after, he returned to the farm and dragged the deer carcass into the barn to butcher it. Ben couldn't understand how John had managed to catch the deer so quickly, as it would have taken him and Ellie forever. However, the main character only briefly explained that over the years, he had learned to do it quickly. Ben then said that his sister had claimed that the eternal flame soldiers were dangerous, and asked John if he was dangerous. Instead of answering, the main character immediately picked up his bloody knife and threw it somewhere to the side. He hit the center of a small target hanging on the opposite wall. Ben was surprised at how John did it, and assumed that he had class, and that the boy himself wanted to have his own class. The man explained that if he practiced throwing knives, he could become a thief, but he still needed to go through the ceremony. Without thinking twice, Ben asked him for a knife, as he also wanted to try throwing it. The hero agreed, but explained that Ben had to be careful, and that his sister was right about how dangerous it was to be a soldier. But apparently this didn't stop the boy, so he raised the knife and prepared to throw it. But instead of hitting the target, it hit a completely different place, namely, the window. The boy was horrified, realizing that he had just simply ruined the barn. But John didn't react to this in any way. He only said that now Ben still had to learn how to change windows. Soon after, he went outside where Ellie was, and noticing that she was collecting grass, he asked if she needed help. The thing is, he just read something in a book called How to Run a House. The girl then asked how their hunt had gone and suggested that he had not managed to catch anyone because he had returned before sunset. However, the man said that the deer had already been cut up and hung in the smokehouse, and then the surprised girl thanked him for everything. The hero understood that he appeared out of nowhere, but he didn't care what was written in the decree, because this was Ellie's house, and her brother's too. He also said that if she had any problems, the eternal flame would deal with them, and the girl was very grateful to John for this. Then she asked if he really thought the book could teach him how to run a household, but the hero merely replied that this was all that was given to him along with the decree, and that he had now settled on the chapter on gardening. Suddenly, unexpectedly for him, Ellie came up and abruptly snatched the book from his hands. Instead, she gave him a shovel and a bag of seeds and asked him to plant them in the ground. At this point, John was confused. He said that he had not yet read the chapter, but had only just started reading it. He realized that he had taken on too much and was clearly not prepared to plant. Then Ellie noted with a smile that in that case he simply wouldn't have been able to cope without her help. John also remembered that Ben had mentioned that she liked books, and he had just brought a couple more with him and left them in his bag by the bed. As soon as the girl heard about the books, her eyes immediately lit up, and John added that these books were not about housekeeping. After that, the two of them gardened until sunset, and at some point, Ellie noted that John was clearly not like the other soldiers. The hero liked this remark, which meant it was good that he was no longer a soldier. But Ellie understood that in any case, he still had a lot to do, and asked if he liked this kind of pension. But John didn't know what to answer. He hadn't thought about it, and hadn't expected that everything would be so monotonous. Then the girl offered to make him a list of what they needed for the farm, and he would help them get it. To begin with, she decided to walk through the barn and the materials that were needed to repair it. First of all, she wrote down that they needed wood, a plow, and seemed to be going to stop there. But then the main character added with a smile that they would also need a new window. Ellie was puzzled because she thought all the windows in their barn were intact. Instead of answering, John pointed at her brother Ben, who was still trying unsuccessfully to throw knives. Ellie was unhappy, but she understood what the protagonist was hinting at, so she added a new window to the list. While she was writing, John noticed that she had strange purple burns on her arm that were visible from under her clothes. However, Ellie immediately hurried to roll up her sleeves and hide them, without answering John's question about what happened here. Instead, she turned sharply, handed him the list of items he needed, and started to leave. The protagonist looked at the list and noted that there was wood there, and that getting it was not a problem at all. The very next day, he went to the forest to get the necessary materials. He decided to act like an ordinary person and even took an axe with him, but apparently he did not know how to use it. He began to strike at the tree trunk, but his success was mixed. At some point, John stopped and realized that everything was going rather slowly, so he decided that he, specifically, worked better without tools, and used his fiery hand to cut down the tree in an instant. The cut was incredibly smooth, and the finished tree trunk immediately fell to the ground. Once everything was ready, the protagonist walked up to the trunk, picked it up with both hands, and headed back to the farm. As soon as he arrived, Ellie and Ben noticed strange sounds behind them. They were very surprised when they saw that John had brought such a huge tree trunk all by himself. In answer to their silent question, he said he simply drank a lot of milk as a child, and then asked the boys to take care of the farm while he worked on the barn. At that moment, Ellie realized that John was cool, and Ben said that in that case he would drink a lot of milk too. Looking at his happy brother and sister, John noted that perhaps it was a good thing that this whole situation had happened to him. After some time, he prepared boards to repair the roof of the barn. The hero was going to help the boys, and then go his own way. Meanwhile, Ellie and Ben were doing their part of the work, and after a while, everything was ready. By that time, the main character was resting on the hay in the barn. Since everything was ready, he could afford to sleep a little. The brother and sister went into the barn to tell him that everything was ready, but found him sleeping. They hoped they hadn't woken John, but he had already lifted his hat and looked at them. Ellie immediately looked up at the roof and noted that everything was done incredibly well and beautifully. But John said he wasn't finished yet. He needed to get a couple more things from their list and finish the stalls. However, the girl noted that the stalls seemed to be in order and did not understand why anything needed to be changed. At that moment, John couldn't even tell whether she was serious or not. He stated firmly and decisively that he needed cows. The thing was that according to his assignment, which was given to him by a mysterious system, he had to return the cattle to the farm. The men had only one day left to return the cows to him, or John was ready to begin the fun part. At that moment, Ben approached him and noted that it was very hot near John. The hero said that it was because it was summer, and Ben pointed out that in that case they had better hurry, otherwise they would miss the planting time. The hero noted that he was right, and asked Ben to call his sister. They would go get a plow and buy some groceries at the same time. Soon after, the three of them arrived in the city in a horse-drawn cart. John dropped Ellie and Ben off in town and arranged to meet them when he had spoken to the blacksmith and asked them to give him directions. The girl pointed in the right direction and said that the blacksmith was behind the hotel to the left. After some time, the main character arrived at the required building, where he announced that he needed a plow that could be pulled by a horse or an ox. Inside, he met a woman who was the blacksmith. She introduced herself, saying that her name was Garrett. She realized that John had inherited the farm from Burroughs and welcomed him to town. And then the hero realized that rumors spread very quickly here. Garrett explained that she was wary of newcomers, especially after recent unpleasant events. As it turned out, the main character was aware that murders took place here and that bandits lived there. He understood that every city had its share of crime, but he didn't expect it to be this bad here. Garrett explained that the people were also saying that there was a witch here, and they were asking for Imperial Knights to be sent here to deal with her. But John wasn't afraid of witches or magic. He planned to stay here, and even though it wasn't the best town to settle down in, Garrett wished him luck. Jonas also said that John was considered to be involved with the Wolf King's gang, and they were very serious guys. Garrett explained that everyone here was discussing each other's affairs, and also remembered that a couple of adventurers had recently passed through the city. John realized that they were talking about mercenaries. He had heard that most of them were wandering former soldiers who were hungry for profit. However, Garrett decided to return to blacksmithing. She asked to give her a few days, or better yet a week, so that she could prepare a plow. John also said he needed a large cleaver, carpentry tools, parts for an outdoor stove, nails, 2 wheels for a cart, a lintel, and glass for the windows. At that moment, the saleswoman came out of the store and started yelling at Ellie and Ben, saying that they hadn't served people like that. She even threw an apple at the girl's head, declaring that this city did not need their blood money. At this point, John had already finished his business and arrived to them, asking the worried brother and sister what had happened. Ellie tried to pretend nothing had happened, but Ben said that these people thought his sister was a witch. As soon as the main character heard this, he asked the guys to follow him. He had one thought. They went back to the store they were kicked out of, and he said that, frankly, it seemed like the saleswoman had a problem with them. The woman also started yelling at him, declaring that witches weren't allowed in here, even if accompanied. Then John took something out of his pocket and said that Ellie was not a witch. She was under his care, and then asked the saleswoman to call the manager. As soon as the woman saw the emblem he gave her, she realized with horror that it was an Imperial Knight in front of her. The hero asked her if his seal could lie, and then the woman hastened to apologize and said that she would call the owner. Soon a man came out to them. He didn't think that he would see the Imperial Knight of the Eternal Flame here, and assumed that he came to deal with the witch. However, John said that he came to apologize to Ellie and this boy, and then they were supposed to give him the items from their list. The shop owner did not argue with the knight and asked him to forgive them, since they behaved this way because of all these murders and the story with the witch. But then the hero once again drew their attention to the emblem and asked them to think twice. He stated that the woman was under the protection of the Eternal Flame, but apparently Ellie did not like these words at all, so she turned around and walked towards the exit, asking them not to drag her into all of this, and to just give them the items from the list. As soon as everything was ready, the 3 boys began loading the bags into the cart. Ben was very happy that they now had so much food. However, Ellie said she was very grateful, but asked that something like this not happen again. She realized that John was no ordinary soldier, for the Imperial Knights of the Eternal Flame were his most valued confidants. She knew they were wizard killers and witch hunters, but John said that was no longer true since he was retired. Then Ellie assumed that it was Jonas who sent him after her, but the hero hastened to justify himself. Besides, he knew that she was not a witch. He finally wanted to create something, not destroy it. The Eternal Flame was not what people imagined it to be, and he himself left there at the first opportunity. But judging by the girl's expression, this didn't convince her very much, so she asked if John needed anything else, and stated that she and Ben could manage without him. The hero replied that there was one place left that he should stop by before leaving. He also asked her and Ben to try not to do anything wrong again, but Ellie couldn't promise him anything. On the way to the main saloon in town, John thought that the situation could not be worse. But judging by everything, this place was quite decent, so he decided to rest here and then go look for a place to spend the night. He told the owner that he had a nice hotel, and he agreed. It was the safest hotel thanks to Sheriff George. The hero asked how many sheriffs there were here, but the man said that there was only one. George Wells lived on the edge of the village, and at this time, he usually came here for dinner. John was pleased with this news, since in this case he would be able to talk to him again. However, at that moment, a group of people burst into the saloon. They said that they were adventurers from Red Coral and had come here to find a place to stay for the night. One of them asked John to tell them the way, but the main character replied that he was also passing through. The adventurer said that he didn't want any trouble, but the people here weren't particularly friendly. But John didn't want to talk to him. He wasn't interested in the man. Having received no information, the adventurers headed for the exit. noting that the people here were very rude. At that moment, Sheriff George sat down at the counter, clearly unhappy that these adventurers had come here again. However, he noted that John drove them away even faster than he did, to which the hero replied that he simply did not like such lawless people. The saloon owner explained that they came here once every couple of days, and asked about the Mage's Tower. The word was as old as the world. Then John told the sheriff that he wanted to report to him about the theft of the cows. They were stolen by a certain whale, who works for the Wolf King. The sheriff knew him. He was a local joker. But the hero said that he did not want to write a statement against him. Instead, he wanted to find out where he lived. The sheriff explained that he should be careful. He didn't like vigilantes here. But he still said that he lived in the Wolf's Lair, a bandit hideout in the mountains. He asked the protagonist to be careful with Javier, the Wolf King. He was the tamer, and also the leader of this company. George explained that they weren't going into town, but John was an easy target for them while on the farm, so he needed to take care of himself. However, now it was time for the sheriff to go since he still needed to keep an eye on these adventurers. John decided to ask the bartender about Javier, and he said that he was a big shot. They said that he had 1,000 wolves. At that moment, the main character suddenly heard Ellie's voice outside. Apparently she was in trouble. When the man came outside, he saw that he and Ben had been pelted with stones. At this moment, John became truly furious. Now he had no intention of sparing these people. As it turned out, Ellie and Ben were pelted with stones by local children, and their father just watched it all with a grin. Ellie tried to fight them off with a wooden stick, but she wasn't very successful. As she waved the stick, the children became afraid that she was putting a curse on them. Seeing John standing nearby, the girl asked him not to come closer, as she was afraid that he would only make things worse. Then the children's father intervened and threw a large stone at the girl, saying that with the help of fire they would eradicate this magic from this world. John froze in horror, watching as a huge rock flew straight at the girl. Ellie didn't have time to dodge, and the stone hit her right in the temple, from which blood immediately gushed. And then the main character realized that he could no longer stand aside. He stood right in front of his brother and sister, protecting them with his body. The man immediately began to take out his sword, saying that since he dared to defend this dirty witch, he was an enemy of the eternal flame. But before he could finish speaking, John was already standing in front of him, saying that it was he who was the opponent of the eternal flame. He stated that the eternal flame had ended the war against magic, and one had to think before throwing around words like a magician or a witch. After that, he threw the man with all his might straight into the barrel of water. Then he turned to the children and said that if they valued their lives, they needed to run away from here. The children immediately apologized to John and hurried to escape the scene. The rest of the residents watched in horror as it happened. They did not understand who John was, since he so easily dealt with Mr. Tanner, who was a strong man. After this, the main character approached Ellie, helped her get up, and also examined her wound. But Mr. Tanner was not going to give up. He climbed out of the barrel and again ran at John with a sword. The protagonist managed to push the girl aside so that the sword strike would not hit her, and then he jumped back in the other direction. Tanner looked at Ellie with fury and said that his cause was just because he was killing witches. He assumed she had charmed the man, but that trick wouldn't work on him. He began to slowly approach Ellie and declared that her death would be the last one this city would see. But John declared that he had said enough, after which he threw a hot stone right into his face. The mere contact with the stone burned Tanner's cheek and he screamed in incredible pain. But the main character didn't even give him time to come to his senses. Instead, he attacked him with his foot right in his bloody cheek. The blow was so strong that the man simply fell on his back, and blood gushed from his wound. With his last strength, he tried to reach the stone to attack these demons in return. Finally, he threw a stone at Ellie, hoping that the eternal fire would help them incinerate these creatures. But the stone never reached the girl's face because John intercepted it in time. He clenched his hand and smashed the stone into small pieces, asking Tanner once again not to take his name in vain. When the man saw that he had broken the stone so easily, he froze in horror, still not understanding who he had been unlucky enough to encounter. The hero looked at him defiantly and asked Tanner why he didn't attack them anymore. After this, John came close to him, put his hand on his head and said that the stone was harder than the skull. The man understood the hint and immediately began to beg John for forgiveness and ask for mercy. The protagonist then hit him hard in the face, causing the man to fall back to the ground. He put his foot on Tanner's chest as he choked on his own blood and said that all right, he would spare him. He turned to all the spectators and said that this would be a warning to them all. They saw the speck in someone else's eye, but did not notice the log in their own eyes. At that moment, Tanner's wife ran out into the square and ordered John to remove his leg from her husband's body. The hero noted with displeasure that her husband was endangering the children by inciting them to throw stones at the so-called witch. But the woman did not listen to him at all. She continued to accuse John of almost killing her husband. In response, John simply calmly stated that if a witch were in his place, she would definitely kill him. She would kill him with a curse. flaying his skin with pustules that would eat away at his flesh and bones. So he asked the woman to be glad that Ellie wasn't a witch after all. As they were leaving, he told the woman that if he were in her place, he would discipline the scoundrel, so that he would not do anything like that again. The boys went into the saloon to treat Ellie's wound, and John couldn't help but think that maybe he shouldn't have taken them along. However, what worried the girl most was that now the rumors about her would become even worse. She explained that the townspeople think that she is to blame for the death of a girl who died a couple of years ago. Ben explained that people thought Ellie had seduced the village chief with magic, but he didn't understand who would want that old freak. And yet his sister asked him to be a little quieter, and not to say such words in public places. John asked her if it was true. He didn't mean temptation. He asked if the headman really liked Ellie. The girl confirmed that unfortunately this was the case, but she was surprised that John, apparently, was not afraid of rumors. He replied that, given that all these people were still alive, it was empty chatter. He felt mana in Ellie, but it was not enough for her to be a witch. Soon after, he bandaged her wounds. Unfortunately, he didn't know healing magic, but he knew a little about field medicine. Ellie was surprised that John even knew that much. She thought the Imperial Knights were only good for destroying everything around them. Then John said that he had something for them. Tomorrow he would go to return his cows, and they needed protection. He offered to show the brother and sister a few techniques if they wanted, and then gave Ellie a knife. He also had something for Ben, since he had seen how he handled knives. He brought something else for him. As it turned out, he had a hammer in store for the boy. He will need it so that the next time he breaks something, he will help the protagonist fix it. Soon the next morning arrived, and John knew it would be the day of his culmination. He even stated that he did not have time to have breakfast, because if Whale did not return his cows, he would have to deal with him. Ellie doubted that this was worth doing, since bandits were not to be trifled with. But John promised to return before the eggs got cold. After that, he put on his cowboy hat and left the house. The girl still doubted that this man understood who he had decided to go against. Ben noted that John was not particularly intelligent, although he could read, unlike many of the villagers. Soon after, the hero entered the barn. At first, he thought about taking a horse, but decided that running would be faster. He may not have been a very good farmer, but he knew how to slaughter chickens. Soon after, he activated his firepower and ran through the woods towards the place where the bandits lived. He jumped deftly across the mountains and in just a few jumps reached the very top. There he met with the bandit guards and asked if they knew who Whale was. The men immediately ordered John to stop, as they did not know him, and asked him what he wanted there. John explained that he had come to talk to Whale about the cows. He should have been expecting him. But the guards first wanted to ask Whale himself, and also said that John was lucky that the Wolf King was gone. Otherwise he would have fed him to his pack. Another bandit pointed a spear at John and ordered him to stand still while they sorted things out. The protagonist did not object, and asked the men to take their time. They had time before his scrambled eggs got cold. The guard noted that John was quite quiet, and suggested that he and Whale were old friends. He said that there are few people here looking for their cattle. Most want to end up like their cattle, namely, being eaten by wolves. At this point, Whale finally walked out of the gate, but he didn't understand why the guards had brought him here since he hadn't called anyone. But when he saw John sitting on a rock nearby, a look of genuine surprise appeared on his face. The protagonist, with a sly grin, said that he was very glad to see him again, and asked the man how he was doing. He shook his hand, and said that these 3 days had dragged on for a very long time. He assumed Whale was very busy since he still hadn't returned his cows. Hearing this, the bandit laughed and said that John shouldn't act tough just because he broke someone's arm. However, if he wasn't joking about these cows, he was either very brave or very stupid. After that, he snapped his fingers, and in an instant, bandits with iron sticks in their hands appeared behind him. John smiled and remarked that they looked like good guys, and asked them if they had ever heard of the Fairford murders. However, Whale told him that neither his guys nor he himself knew about it. The tall man asked who it was, and Whale replied that it was the new, cheeky farmer who lived with Ellie, and mistakenly thought that the cows were his. Then the big man came close to John. He was surprised that he actually came. He noted that it was a brave act, so he decided to give him a choice. He could either slide down the mountain, or he would throw John off it. But John didn't answer that. He assumed that the Wolf King was their boss, and maybe he knew where his cows were. The man was very angry at this, and he rushed at John, saying that he would not come near the Wolf King. But before he could strike, John punched him in the stomach with all his might, saying that he wouldn't be so sure about that. From such a strong blow, the big guy fell to the ground and coughed loudly, clearly not expecting such force from this stranger. And then the rest of the bandits raised their weapons and rushed at John, intending to teach him a lesson for such insolent behavior. But before they could do so, John grabbed one of them by the head, and with one deft movement broke his neck. The man fell dead to the ground, and the protagonist was ready to face the next opponent. Without waiting for an answer from the bandits, he deftly intercepted their weapons and pierced them with their own metal sticks. The remaining bandit, seeing what was happening, immediately rushed away. But John had no intention of leaving anyone alive. He grabbed the man by the cloak and said that since he was running away, he would help him. He then spun the bandit around by his cloak and threw him off the cliff. There were still several bandits behind the main character, including the big guy who was still on the ground. Suddenly, one of the men grabbed the main character under the armpits, rejoicing at having managed to immobilize him. However, it was not difficult for John to break free from his grip, after which he grabbed the bandit's arms with his fiery hands. He then sent 2 men flying with an elbow strike, surprised that that was all they could do. At that moment, the big guy's body began to emit a strange purple aura, and he declared that the stranger should have chosen an opponent equal in strength. The main character was very happy that his opponent finally became the owner of the class. The big guy roared and seemed to grow even larger, but the hero wasn't afraid, and merely noted that he was in pretty good shape, meaning he was probably a barbarian. However, he asked the bandit not to worry, as he himself could use mana reinforcement. He intended to show the man whose bones were stronger, after which he struck him with all his might with a red-hot rod. When the big man felt the force of the blow, he screamed in incredible pain. Before the man could even process anything, John appeared behind him, ready to strike again. He brought down a red-hot iron rod directly on his neck, and this blow proved fatal for the barbarian. He fell face down on the ground, while the protagonist didn't get a scratch. Once the bandits were dealt with, he rose to his feet and headed back to Whale, with whom he had unfinished business. The man was terrified, anticipating what awaited him, given how the outsider had dealt with his people. The protagonist loomed ominously over the bandit and repeated his intention to deal with the cows first. Meanwhile, Ben and Ellie were sitting at home because the girl hadn't eaten her breakfast, and her brother wanted to finish her portion instead of her. While he was eating, the girl asked him if he thought they had made a mistake. Ben didn't understand the meaning of her concern, so she then tried to find out if he thought John could really be trusted. The thing was that John started fights with bandits, and was previously an Imperial Knight of the Eternal Flame. However, Ben claimed that the past didn't matter, and he was probably already dead since there was no one stronger than the Wolf King. Ellie explained that John was a retired knight, and Ben had simply misunderstood. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. The brother and sister froze, not understanding who could have come. When the girl approached the door and carefully opened it, she saw the village elder Jonas standing on the threshold. When the man noticed the girl, he smiled broadly and said that he had come to discuss something important. Ellie began to close the door, repeating her persistent reluctance to move in with him, while the man insisted that it was dangerous to stay there. In his opinion, John was up to something bad, and the girl realized that he had settled her here specifically so that she would later move in with him. The man reminded that he was the head of the village, which meant that people would listen to him if he found Ellie innocent. However, the girl remained serious and asked him to come back, although it was clear that Jonas was not going to back down. Then Ben intervened, interrupting them, and stated that his sister thought Jonas was ugly. The headman was taken aback, and Ben tried to justify himself, explaining that he was only trying to help. Then the man calmed down, but still noted that Ellie did not understand much. In his opinion, normal people retired during the war, but John continued to fight until the very end. This meant that to a certain extent he enjoyed killing. However, Ellie stated that she didn't care even if he was a murderer, because based on the rumors about her, it was suitable company for a witch. She asked Jonas not to think that his status as the village leader would save him from her telling people who he really was. The man then admitted that his words had sounded rude, and asked that his sincere apologies be conveyed to John. He noted that being the head of the village was difficult. Sometimes he didn't even have time to cook. But Ellie didn't like such excuses. After that, she threw the plate on the floor with all her force, breaking the dishes into small pieces. At that moment, Jonas realized the seriousness of her intentions and headed for the exit. However, he still asked the girl to remember that he could make all the rumors disappear. The girl realized that to a certain extent he was telling the truth. John would not be around if the war were still going on. Instead of being here, he would continue fighting for the Eternal Flame, and most likely he would enjoy such an activity. However, Ellie didn't understand how anyone could enjoy killing, especially after the horror she had experienced. Memories of those days when the entire city and its inhabitants were burned came back to her mind. She was lucky to survive, but now getting food has become extremely difficult. Eventually, she found an apple among the rubble and was delighted that she could finally eat. However, before she could take the first bite, someone fired, knocking the fruit out of her hands. A red-haired woman with a crossbow in her hands was approaching her, but Ellie tried to remain firm and ordered her not to approach. The stranger only laughed and declared her submission to the Eternal Flame. Ellie wondered in her mind why she had appeared here, since they had already caused enough destruction, leaving people without food, water, and shelter. However, the woman said that she had arrived on direct orders from the Eternal Flame to exterminate the mages. She pointed the gun at Ellie while the girl tried to prove that they were ordinary civilians. The stranger claimed that they had been peaceful only before, but now they were only a target. Ellie realized the seriousness of her intentions and prepared to defend her life with a sword. However, being an ordinary girl, she did not know how to handle a weapon, and fear gripped her body, causing it to tremble. Even at the present moment, her thoughts often returned to the Imperial Knight of the Eternal Flame. She understood that people who obeyed the orders of such a man became bloodthirsty killers. Suddenly, Ellie heard a noise outside and assumed it could be John. When she went outside, she saw that he was lying on the grass and petting the cows he had brought with him. The girl didn't understand how he returned so quickly, because his breakfast hadn't had time to get cold. John explained that everything had gone well. Whale had been responsive, and he shouldn't cause any problems anytime soon. The hero also noted that he saw Jonas leaving and conveyed to him a request not to appear again without an invitation. At this point, Ben intervened in the conversation, bringing harnesses for the cows. The harness fit perfectly, and then John asked if they had ropes to tie it to the plow. Ben explained that Old Man Burrows had used chains and immediately added that he would buy them from Garrett when they got the plow. However, now that he had the cows back, he needed Ellie to teach him how to milk them. Soon after, they began training, but the main character was not doing very well. While he was trying to milk the cow, the girl suddenly noticed that there were burns on his hands. However, the main character was just joking and said that he was just rather careless, which is why he got burned. He then pointed to the spots on Ellie's hands and asked her to tell the story of how they appeared. Then she recalled that her city was destroyed during the war, burned to the ground by the Eternal Flame. He set the entire city on fire, and in the following days, while they were picking through the ashes, his Imperial Knights came to kill those who remained, at the behest of the Eternal Flame. She and Ben were the only survivors from their village. She found the boy in the rubble, and they have been together ever since. When the protagonist heard that the Imperial Knights had come for the civilians, he was in real shock. Ellie confirmed that this was indeed the case, and since then, she has had a goal. She suddenly picked up a knife and declared that she was going to get to the Eternal Flame. From that day on, she lived for the purpose of one day killing him. Soon the protagonist received another skill point, but he didn't know what to do with it, since he already had everything maxed out. He would be very happy if someone provided him with instructions on what to do once everything was improved. Whoever came up with this game must have been very good at keeping their mouths shut, and none of the locals even knew that John was seeing this system. Soon, John had a new task, and also noted that these doom points had been increasing since he first appeared in this world. It was a full 15 years ago, and he still doesn't know why it happened. And besides, he hasn't learned a single spell yet. It happened on the day when he went hiking with his older brother and his friend. They stopped in the forest and pitched a tent. His younger brother was surprised that John was so calm, but he stated that he had always loved fresh air and insects. And suddenly the guy noticed that John had hidden the console he had been secretly playing with behind his back. The older brother immediately began to take the console away from John, because he promised that he would not play any games outdoors. When the mock fight ended, the protagonist headed to his tent to hide the console. He jokingly noted to himself that spending time with his brothers was greatly overrated. And then something unexpected happened. The main character's tent seemed to be enveloped in magic, and terrible sounds were heard from outside. When John looked out of the tent, he saw that there was a real massacre outside. It seemed like bandits were fighting against cowboys. Right before the protagonist's eyes, one of the men was pierced by an icy blade. John didn't understand what was happening. He turned to the dead soldier and asked what was going on here. The soldier then said that John seemed to have been called upon to fight for Le Pierre, and they must lose. John immediately rushed to pull the ice shard out of his chest, and the soldier explained that he, too, had been conscripted many years ago. After that, he handed the protagonist a strange scroll and stated that this is what they are fighting for. Perhaps it will help John more than him. The hero, in horror, asked him if it was possible to get out of here. But the knight said that there was no way out of this world except one way. At that moment, the man who killed the soldier approached him and said that the only way out of here was death. He asked John not to mourn him, as this was just a game for the summoned, and then demanded that he give him the scroll. John was surprised that the man would kill them for the scroll, but he asked him not to touch it, as it was worth more than 10 of his lives. Yet John didn't listen. Instead, he learned a new spell called Fireball. Even though he didn't know how it worked, he immediately activated it and ordered the man to stay away. However, the man realized that John had the potential to become a magician, and he invited him to go with him and undergo the class initiation ceremony. He also asked that they view him not as a person, but as one of the many characters in the game they called home. But John was also a player. The man declared that his death would not be forgotten, because murder was a necessary routine, and the kingdom would not conquer itself. To the man's surprise, John nevertheless agreed to join him. After this, they shook hands, but the main character's palms suddenly became engulfed in flames. The man in the hat was horrified. He looked down, not believing what was happening. John's power was burning him alive, and he couldn't break free from its deadly grip. When the man was burned, the hero received a level-up notification for killing an NPC. Now John was thinking about the fact that Ellie wanted to kill the eternal flame, and he believed that she really deserved it. Suddenly the girl entered his room and said that it was getting hot in there, so she suggested opening all the windows. The hero was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not answer. He decided that he should tell her where the eternal flame was, and let her kill him. He remembered the day when he saw the early girl among the rubble of the building. He had met Ellie before. The girl's voice brought him back to reality, and he finally allowed her to open the window. He apologized, saying that he had been momentarily immersed in meditation and could only restore his mana through breathing and concentration. Ellie reminded him that they needed to go into town to pick up the plow, and she felt more at ease shopping now thanks to John. Soon after, they arrived in town, and on the way Ellie told them that there were several farms nearby, as well as people living deep in the valley or on the slopes. However, Ben reminded her that there were also Grims and Spectra, but her sister said that they did not exist. The main character was still interested in this topic, and he asked the boy to tell him more about it. Ben explained that the Grims were small, with flat faces and skin like stone, and the Spectres were short, ghostly creatures. Soon they arrived at the blacksmith's, where Garrett was already waiting for them. Apparently the work was done. She reported that she had done all the things John had asked for, and he thanked her for her hard work. He apologized for having to say goodbye so soon, but explained that they still had some things to do. After that, they went to the store to buy groceries, and although the owners did not like their presence, they did not say anything. As they left, John noted that their faces looked as if they had met a terrible witch and a noble imperial knight. He also expressed gratitude to Ellie for allowing him to help them, but the girl asked him not to get used to it. The man said he wanted to plant wheat today using his new plow, but the girl wasn't sure the wheat would survive the winter. However, John assured her that the book said that everything would be fine. When they arrived home, John was preparing to set up the plow, and Ben brought him an ox to do it. When the hero looked at the animal, he decided to name him Ferdy. After this, the boy headed towards the house to help his older sister unload the cart. John noted that everything worked as he wanted. To lure the cows down the mountain, you need to crystallize mana. Seeing the bull's delighted expression, he realized that he really wanted this mana stone. As far as the protagonist could see, all living creatures loved mana very much. Once the bull had eaten the long-awaited stone, it was time to attach a new plow to it. But the stone charged the bull so hard that he began to run around the field, and John could not catch him for a long time. When he finally got the plow attached, he experienced an incredible sensation because the bull became truly mad. Ellie watched in horror, completely unable to understand what was happening. When it was all finished, John proudly declared that he and Ferdy had plowed everything. However, everything was not as rosy as the main character imagined, since all the furrows were crooked. Ellie sighed. She thought that this was exactly why John kept them here. They needed to work off the cost of keeping the animals. Then the hero asked her if she wanted to say that the work he had done was not very good. Without a twinge of conscience, the girl replied that she really thought so. She then turned to Ferdy the bull and walked with him to the field to show John how to make furrows properly. On the way, she asked him if he had ever seen an ox plow, but in fact, the hero knew nothing about it and had never seen one. After some time, the main character finally figured it out when Ellie noted that he even went overboard with it. The thing is that now they had a lot of milk, and there was nowhere to store it. Moreover, if it stood for more than a day, it could go sour. Another problem was that no one in town would buy fresh milk from them because everyone thought Ellie was a witch. So the girl suggested making cheese or butter from the milk. She hated wasting food, but she wasn't sure she would be able to do it in time. She didn't expect John to be so passionate about farming, because he doesn't seem like the type of person who enjoys it. And then the hero asked her who he looked like in that case. Ellie replied that he looked like someone who would hate his retirement, someone who would want to remain a soldier until the very end. The hero replied that he really had no choice. He didn't want to lie and stated that retirement was much more difficult for him than it had been during the war. The reason was that war was predictable. You either died or you didn't, and there was simply no time to worry about anything else. After the war, John didn't know what to expect from the next day. He just lived in terror, waiting for tomorrow, thinking that it would never end. However, now he has to create something, not destroy it. Their conversation was interrupted by Ben, who said that Sheriff Wells had come to see them. The main characters immediately rose to their feet, and John calmly declared that he would now sort everything out. He went outside with a bucket of milk, where he met Sheriff George. The man saw the bucket and noted that, apparently, John had already returned the cows to himself. He then invited him to come inside and talk privately. As soon as they entered the house, John offered him some fresh milk, but the sheriff refused. He said that when he told John where to look for whale, he didn't want him to start something like that. But John pretended not to understand what the sheriff was talking about. Then the man explained that there was a rumor going around the city that Layla and Jemal were found naked hanging from poles. John just calmly stated that they shouldn't have stolen their cows, and then the sheriff continued, saying that bodies had been found nearby. However, the hero stated that he knew nothing about the path. From the description, it looked more like an internal showdown. He didn't think Whale and Jamal would be causing trouble in town anytime soon, and he doubted the sheriff would arrest a humble farmer trying to survive. Instead of answering, George took a glass of fresh milk and drank it in one gulp. He then stated emphatically that John was right, and the deaths must have been the work of the Wolf King Javier. Apparently, he was not happy with the way John treated his boys and the cows. They couldn't just part ways under those conditions. However, the sheriff still asked John not to do such things anymore, since class holders must behave in a civilized manner. However, he was grateful to him for dealing with these troublemakers, and also thanked the hero for the milk. George promised to stop by later to get more milk, and maybe even some cheese, and then said goodbye to the hero. John also wished the sheriff a good day, and they parted on a good note. That evening, Ellie asked John why the sheriff had come, to which he replied that he was just an old friend who had dropped in for some milk. The girl said that if they found a place to store it, they would be able to make enough cheese to take to the city to sell. But for storage, they needed a larger container to heat the milk in. This container had to be made of iron, but it would be very expensive and extremely difficult to obtain, so a stone one could be considered. Widow Brown had told her about an abandoned stone mine in the western mountains the last time they went egg hunting. As soon as John heard this, he said that he would go there and come back soon. He promised the girl that he would definitely bring a larger container so that there would be enough space for everything they needed. As soon as John was alone, he activated his fire skill again and rushed at incredible speed. It was no trouble for him to reach the place Ellie had spoken of in a matter of minutes. He immediately jumped onto the steep mountain and rushed up. Stopping on the cliff, he thought that he would never get tired of this view. All these incredible landscapes, especially from such a height, caused him genuine delight. However, now he had business to attend to, so without hesitation John jumped straight down into the shaft itself. Once down, he activated his fire skill to slightly illuminate the area around him. He then walked over to the stones he intended to split to bring home. For him, this was the most ideal option, so he immediately began preparing the spell. When everything was ready, he split part of the stone with one blow of his hand. The next moment, the huge boulder simply split into small pieces. After some time, a huge container was already standing in front of the main character. Still, John wondered if he should check with Ellie about how big a container they needed. And then he suddenly felt that the ground under his feet began to shake. John was not afraid, but he realized that, apparently, something had awakened from sleep. When he looked up, he realized that in front of him stood stone giants with purple crystals on their faces. And then the main character realized that these were the very same Grimms that the boy Ben had spoken about. However, they were not at all like what he described. John heard that if the monster ate mana, it would become smarter. He assumed that these stone guys could talk, so he showed them the light and declared that he came in peace. The man said that there was no need for them to fight each other. But the stone giants didn't care. They suddenly opened their mouths and rushed to attack John. Thus, the protagonist had no choice but to solve this problem the hard way. He jumped back in time from the place where the giant's huge stone hand struck. After this, he prepared to attack back, saying that they had no need to pretend at all. John thrust his palm forward and a fiery projectile flew out. It hit one of the giants squarely in the shoulder, and its force was enough to knock him off his feet. While the other giants tried to bring their comrade back to his senses, John declared that it was just a warm-up. He didn't want to end so quickly. He missed the battle. Suddenly, the fallen giant leaned towards his comrade's ear and whispered something to him in his own language. At this point, the remaining two giants entered the battle, but the protagonist apparently was ready for this. In response, John prepared another fire skill. He was eager to try it out. In an instant, the small fireball turned into a huge one, several times larger than John himself in size. As soon as he launched the spell at the stone giants, he himself jumped to the side. A second later, a powerful explosion occurred in the place where he had just been standing. But the stone giants were not going to give up so easily. One of them struck the ground with all his might. John was forced to dodge the blow as it shattered the ground into a pile of rubble. When the dust settled, the protagonist realized that the giants were trying to surround him. But for him, this was all childish babble, since he had already prepared another spell. He released a huge fireball at the stone giants, who were no match for him. And then suddenly that picture popped into his head when he met Ellie in her bloody dress, standing in the middle of the destroyed barn. By that time, John's huge fireball had almost touched the faces of the stone monsters. John knew he needed to incinerate these giants. But then he realized they were just living here. When the stone giants saw a small light not far from them, surprise appeared on their faces. The protagonist realized that these guys seemed to really like his fireballs. He chuckled slightly. That boy Ben was so afraid of these monsters. But in fact, they turned out to be quite harmless. After this, the main character snapped his fingers, and suddenly a spark appeared above the giants' heads. They immediately raised their heads and began to look for the source of the sound. A moment later, the entire cave was illuminated by a bright light, as John summoned small lights to entertain these giants. Apparently, they had never dealt with fire before, and so it was incredibly interesting for them. Moreover, they could not resist the attraction of mana, and John explained that where he received it, there was much more of it. However, he was interested in what these giants could provide him in return. At that moment, they dug a hole and pulled out a chest, locked with a lock. Apparently, this exchange interested the protagonist, and he immediately squatted down to open it. But as soon as he approached the chest, one of the giants began to growl threateningly. John realized that they wanted his mana in exchange for the chest, and he was glad that he had learned something. So he summoned 2 mana stones, which he was willing to give in exchange for this chest. After that, he threw the pebbles straight into the giant's hand. As soon as the exchange was completed, the giant pushed the long-awaited chest towards the protagonist. Without thinking twice, John squatted down and opened the treasure chest. Inside, he found a grafted flower. He knew that the only ones who could enclose their mana in flowers were mages. John assumed that the Grimms knew how to bargain because they had been in the mountains. Perhaps they had fed on plants from the magical garden. John thought that he and Catherine were the only magicians left. He realized that they would have come for him, considering what he had done here. After this, he addressed the giants one last time and said that he now had to go. Finally, he threw them a few more magic crystals as a gift for their generosity. After some time, John dragged the huge stone container to the farm and lay down to sleep in it. When morning came, Ellie's voice woke him up. The girl suggested that he had been trying to drag this huge container all night, and John did not deny it. As the girl guessed, he didn't think to measure her to see if she could fit into the house. Although Ellie was grateful for his help, she didn't understand what to do with all this now. She also noticed that John often slept outside, so she brought him a blanket. But the hero said that it was an accident. He was just overworked at night. The girl noted that, apparently, he was used to working very hard, and then asked him to go inside to have breakfast. John thought that he had not had all this security, shelter, warm food, and peace for 15 long years. Watching his brother and sister's life, he realized that he didn't deserve this, especially after everything he had done. John considered himself as terrible as the mages who had called him to war, mana pulsing through his veins, his lungs, and inside him. If he relaxes even a little or takes one wrong breath, the place will burn in an instant. In this terrible game, magic was nothing more than a curse. It was what caused the apocalypse. John was afraid that another wizarding war would come, and this time he would start it, and everything he did seemed to bring him closer to it. The hero tried to collect his thoughts, but the terrifying images did not leave his mind. So he said he had something to do, but he would be back soon. After that, he went to the garden, where he planted the very flower that he found from the giants. While he was looking at him, Ellie came out to check on John. She noted that this flower was very beautiful and looked very fragile. In response, the main character said that life, in principle, is a very fragile thing. The girl replied that everything in this world is fragile, not just life. Life, in her opinion, is a complex structure that constantly needs support. While the boys were talking, they didn't even notice how close they were to each other. Ellie was very pleased in John's company, and she even laid her head on his shoulder, after which she fell asleep for a short time. At that very moment, John received a notification that his doom points had dropped by 1, and the apocalypse was retreating. When they had rested, the girl declared that with the large container John had brought, she could handle the cooking in 1 day. The hero decided to observe this, since it is pointless to have cows and not know what to do with them. If he is going to be a farmer, then he needs to understand this business. He thought to himself that he would restore this place and leave. But other options would be unfair to Ellie. The girl said that not everything can be solved by simply doing it quickly. Sometimes things take time. And although John said that he had enough patience, he decided not to delay and shot fire from his finger to make a fire. Ellie was very surprised at how easily he was able to set fire to such a huge pile of firewood. It seemed as if this fire frightened her very much, and she even recoiled from it. After that, she stood up and said that John needed to get a shovel, and then they would begin. First, it was necessary to heat the milk to body temperature, then add rennet and let it sit covered until noon. During this time, she could do other things, such as looking after animals or cleaning. Her grandmother always said that different hands are the dragon's tool. The girl said that her grandmother was everything to her, but she died when the village burned down, despite fighting with all her might. She then said that it was better to crush the curds when they had settled, so that the whey would separate, and then leave them to settle again. After an hour, the cheese skin is formed, after which the curd is separated from the whey. Then it needs to be salted and then pressed. You need to press upwards until all the whey is gone, and then leave it to infuse for 2 days. Once the whey has been released, it needs to be left to infuse again. The cheese needs to infuse for about 2 months, and only then will it become tasty. When John tried the finished cheese, he noted that it was incredibly tasty. The only downside was the long wait. However, now he was worried about the question of where they would fit all this. Perhaps a storage room would be suitable, and he could also make himself a bedroom and a cesspool. However, while the boys were talking, Ben ran up to them and said in a panic that something was wrong with the bull. The boy was very upset. It seemed to him that the bull was dying. John and Ellie immediately rushed to Ferdy to check on his condition. At this time, the bull was lying on the ground. John turned to his brother and sister, saying that they could go, and that he would handle it himself. Now they could practice the defensive techniques he had taught them for their trip to the city while he dealt with the bull. He confidently stated that he could bring this animal into order. Ellie and Ben obeyed the protagonist, entrusted him with the bull, and went about their business. As soon as they walked away, John pulled out the magic crystal, assuming that was what the bull wanted. When Ferdy saw the stone, he too perked up and prepared to eat it. He wanted the stone so badly that he almost bit off John's hand. John clearly didn't like this, as his entire hand was now covered in drool. Then he brought the bull's harness and said that if he worked well, he would get even more crystals. And as soon as the bull heard this, it was as if a demon had entered into him, and he began to furiously plow the fields. This time they did much better, and John couldn't help but notice the difference between what happened last time. As a reward, he gave the bull another magic crystal, and he happily caught and ate it. However, immediately after this he suddenly took off and ran off somewhere in an unknown direction. After some time, the bull found himself in the forest. He stopped near a stone and began to look around in different directions. Suddenly he threw a stone with his horns and began to sniff the hole that was covered by this stone. The protagonist followed the animal to see where it had gone, and became curious about what it had found there. But as soon as Ferdy heard John's voice, he immediately became aggressive, and John had to justify himself by saying that he just wanted to watch. When he looked into the hole, he saw a strange plant with several sprouts that were glowing strangely. The protagonist realized that this was a plant with traces of mana, but he had never seen anything like it before. He assumed that the bull was feeding the plant mana crystals, and realized that it was time to stop burying them. But as soon as he reached his finger towards the plant, it immediately recoiled. And then John realized that even plants understood what a monster he was. But he found it amusing. Apparently this was the plant that the bull ate, since he became so smart, and John hoped that there would be no side effects. He then gave the bull another mana crystal as a final treat after a hard day. He himself went into the house to see what Ellie and Ben had been doing while he had been going about his business. But when he went inside, there was no one there. As it turned out, his brother and sister were already waiting for him around the corner. The man was about to report that the bull was now okay. However, before he could do this, Ellie peeked out from around the corner and immediately grabbed him by the vest. She used all her strength to lift the man, and then threw him over her shoulder. Ben was also already ready. As soon as John fell to the floor, he prepared to hit him with a broom. But at the very last moment he suddenly smiled broadly and began to hit him with his stick, very little by little. Ellie explained that the hero himself asked them to learn to defend themselves, and said that he would test them, so they prepared themselves. Then John said that they still needed to work on this, because if they wanted to kill the eternal flame, they would need better preparation. The girl said she just wanted to see if she could take on one of his former soldiers, and John said she could hold her own against most in the city. Meanwhile, night had fallen on the city, but some establishments were still open. Tanner was just leaving the saloon. He was very drunk, and still couldn't forget the day they threw stones at the witch. As he walked down the street finishing his beer, a man in a cowboy hat spied on him. He tried to act stealthily. He pulled out his sword and headed straight after the man. He lit a cigarette, using his finger as a lighter, and then quietly greeted Tanner. He turned around in surprise and asked the stranger why he was suddenly walking around in all sorts of dark places at night. At that moment, the cowboy raised his gun, smiled broadly and said that he just wanted to say hello. But before he could strike, Tanner intercepted his sword and told him not to be so hasty in his conclusions. He didn't believe that anyone would actually want to compete with the swordsman, since Tanner was practically accepted into the Imperial Knights. But in response, the cowboy only grinned and said that he himself would find out that no amount of preparation would save him. Then he jumped back sharply from Tanner's blow. Taking advantage of the moment of confusion, he suddenly jumped up behind him, grabbed him by the head and pinned him to the ground. Literally a minute later, the blonde was already dead. His bloody body lay on the ground, and his own sword was stuck in his back. In the morning, the townspeople gathered to bury and honor the memory of Mr. Tanner, who died the previous night. Meanwhile, the main character was busy with his own affairs. He was digging a huge hole. The hole was incredibly huge in size, and now it should be enough for a cheese seller. Ellie, who had been watching everything that was happening, assumed that John was probably very tired. She offered him a cup of tea and asked if he wanted to take a little break. But judging by the fact that the main character had no intention of resting, the girl decided not to insist and offered to bring him some milk. Cold milk was exactly what John wanted at the moment, and Ben also asked him how he could help him. In response, the main character only said that he should try not to break windows anymore. But then he stopped joking and told him to take the hammer John had given him and help him build a cheese cellar. After that, the three of them headed towards the house, and John told the boys that they would need large stones. Apparently, there were no stones of the right size nearby, but this was not a problem for John. He turned to his bull Ferdy and said that it was time to travel. Meanwhile, Ellie went to the cow's pen and told them not to worry, as the bull would be safe with John. Meanwhile, Ben was helping John carry the boards, but a strong gust of wind blew them away. The bull was to blame for everything, as it ran so fast that it even kept up with John, who used his magical skill. Soon they reached stones that were quite suitable in size for the main character's idea. Meanwhile, Ellie was already wondering what this man had in mind, and her younger brother at this time was trying to figure out what to do with these boards. John wasted no time. He used his magical skill to break the huge boulder into many smaller stones. Hearing Ferdy's surprised moo, he asked the bull if he had never seen stones destroyed by fire. Soon everything was ready. The entire cart was loaded with large stones. However, Ferdy was unhappy because the stones were very heavy, and he would not be able to carry them to the farm. John looked at him with a smile. He himself was holding a stone on one shoulder, which was several times larger than the one in the cart. He still decided to encourage his bull, and therefore gave him another magic stone to help him cope with the job. After that, the two of them headed towards the farm, and John hoped that this bull would not get used to constantly feeding magic stones. Then they finally arrived at the farm. Ellie and Ben were still busy with their part of the work. Then the protagonist finally threw the huge boulder off his shoulder, which hit the ground with a loud sound. The girl immediately turned around at the sound, at first not understanding what was happening. But Ben was very scared by the noise and accidentally hit himself right on the thumb with the hammer. He started crying from severe pain. His finger was swollen, and at that time the elder ran to help him. The boy was clearly unhappy. He thought that he should have drunk more milk. Then his sister thought that maybe this was a sign that it was time to go to bed. John said that they should go home, and he would finish everything by the morning. When night fell, the main character had already laid the huge hole he had dug for me as a floor and walls. When everything was ready, he used his skill to finish the job. In the morning, he saw a man on a horse waiting for him near his farmhouse. As it turned out, this man was none other than Sheriff George, who had arrived to meet his acquaintance. He went to knock on the door, but the hero came up to him from behind and told him that he didn't have to do it. He explained that his roommates had worked very long and hard yesterday, so he asked to give them a rest. However, the sheriff was clearly dissatisfied. He asked John not to play the fool and asked him what he knew. The protagonist said that he didn't understand anything, thereby confusing George even more. He didn't understand where he got the audacity to pretend. He asked John to stop fooling around, but he responded by asking what had happened. The sheriff explained that something serious had happened. John was getting tired of trying to guess what had happened, so he asked the sheriff to be more precise. The man asked him one last time if he really didn't know what he was talking about, and John still said no. Suddenly George frowned and said that in that case it was time for him and Ellie to run. The thing is, there was a murder in the city. A man was killed, the owner of the class with whom John fought, the one who threw stones at Ellie. In response, John said that he couldn't talk about how much he would miss him. The sheriff explained that everyone thought that John was the one who did it, and the main character didn't doubt it for a second. However, he didn't understand what was so special about this guy. There were already constant rumors about the girl. The sheriff explained that he was a favorite in the village, a family man. But in reality, he was a worse character than one might think. He even got involved in crime. In response, John stated that he was not going to run away in any case. The sheriff said he was free to do whatever he wanted, but he should be careful. When the man left, John wondered when he would finally have at least one quiet day. Meanwhile, Ellie woke up because she heard someone talking outside. By that time, the main character had already headed towards the front door to enter the house. At the threshold, he bumped into the girl and told her to come to him quickly, but she was surprised that he was already awake. The main character didn't know how to explain all this to her, and so he decided to show her visually. When Ellie approached the cellar, she was shocked because John had actually managed to prepare it completely in just one night. However, before they went down the stairs, he said that people thought that they killed the guy who threw stones at her. George came here to warn them, but John assured her that everything would be fine because he had built a bomb shelter here. There were beds and toilets here, as well as an emergency exit that leads from the house and will collapse the tunnel when a switch is pressed. John explained that he didn't think they would be coming with bombs. He had built this mechanism before he received news from George. The girl couldn't help but notice that this really was an excellent bomb shelter. John knew that he had to be prepared for anything. He would never wish for her to go through what Ellie went through when the eternal flame was in their house. However, he assured the girl that she would be safe here with her brother. She was very pleased to hear this, and she was immensely grateful to John. Then she reached into her bag, remembering that she had also brought something for him. Ellie said that she knitted a nightcap for the main character to make it more comfortable for him to sleep. John took this as a small hint that he still needed to get more sleep. The girl did not deny it. In her opinion, he slept little, and in response, the main character thanked her. This cap was really beautiful. As the day drew to a close, John put on his gift and settled down right on Ferdy's side. He soon discovered that the flower he had recently planted was missing. Apparently someone had taken it, as he sensed mana there. So he decided that he definitely needed to visit those Grims again. At that moment, Ellie came out to him. She noticed that John was in a hurry somewhere, and he said that he would return tomorrow. The girl invited him to have dinner because they were sad that he did not join her, but the man said that he needed to deal with something important. However, the girl was still upset that the dinner she made for him was not that important to John. The man said he appreciated the concern for him and the farm, but he just had to run some errands right now, but he promised to be back for breakfast. Within a couple of minutes, he was back in the forest, using his skill to move at incredible speed. Soon the hero stopped and crouched down a little, preparing for a high jump. He had to jump over a huge ravine and get straight into the mine where he had encountered the stone monsters last time. When he got there, he saw several human-shaped totems, as well as several objects lying on a pedestal nearby. There were 3 flowers lying there, similar to the ones he had planted, a garden trowel, and also a bottle. Nearby stood a stone statue of John with fire in his hand, and in front of him was a stone chest. The main character was very surprised. He could not understand how these stone guys were able to do this. Then his attention fell on the stone chest that was under his feet. He did not understand where it came from at all. Judging by the fact that there were cracks in the stone, John assumed that someone had already set their sights on it. Perhaps it was some kind of grim. As soon as John reached out and touched the lock with a spell, it immediately fell apart into several pieces. Inside the stone chest were the robes of the magicians, as well as a magic lock and a magician's book. John was surprised because in the past, people could easily be killed for such books. Almost every logic lock in the world was enchanted to instantly destroy its contents and the unfortunate person who dared to open it. So John decided to approach the matter correctly. He hoped that the Grim had some clues. Perhaps this could be a guide to the game. However, the hero decided that he couldn't think like that. For him, this was no longer a game. It could be written about a spell of a forbidden level. One such spell had already nearly torn the world to pieces once, and so John decided that no one needed that kind of power. Magic brought too much destruction to this world, and that's why people got rid of magic. It was the first time John had seen a magical creature behave so intelligently, quite carefully, and even learn something new. He hadn't seen any magical flowers with such a mana imprint either. The hero hoped that they would help him understand how to create wheat resistant to mana poisoning. Now that the contents of the chest were ready, John decided it was time to get the missing parts for the cellar. As the protagonist walked through the city, people kept casting sidelong glances at him and whispering behind his back. Although he didn't react to it in any way, he understood that all of this was already a bit too much. He soon arrived at the blacksmith's workshop, but there he was also greeted rather coldly. John was amazed at how everything had changed and explained to the poor, frightened boy that he had come on business. He also said that he might try to jump on him with a knife, but promised that he would not like the consequences. At that moment, Garrett appeared behind the boy and scolded Gary for behaving like that, since he was her best client. She sent him to do some forging, and she took John's list, which was quite impressive. He explained that they were building a cheese cellar, and Garrett said that the plan was ambitious, but it shouldn't take long. Then John asked what was wrong with her apprentice because he kept ironing on them. Garrett explained that this guy Gary just needed time. She also said that the dead man was a good friend of the Wolf King Javier, so she asked John to be careful. As the protagonist headed for the exit, Gary asked Garrett if everything they said about him was really true. He had heard that this John was a mage killer, just like that strange girl with the boy. However, Garrett said that this was not true, because John was a good man, and these murders began long before his arrival. In the morning, Ellie headed to John's room, wondering whether he had returned or not yet. As it turned out, the hero managed to jump out the window at the very last moment. Unfortunately, he didn't get a chance to take a nap, but at least he arrived on time. At that moment, the girl knocked on his door and asked whether he was awake or not. By that time, John was already in bed and said that he had not slept. He was just meditating. He could smell pancakes waiting for him for breakfast, and it brought a smile to his face. The girl explained that she had just prepared them. They were still fresh and hot. Already at the table, she asked John what had woken him up so late at night. What could have been so important that he had missed dinner? John explained that he had found one of these flowers, and the bird had whispered to him that there was something magical about them. At first, the children didn't believe that these flowers were magical, but then the main character demonstrated their power to them. Ellie realized that these flowers were similar to those that John planted outside. She had not seen him lately, but now the hero was happy about what had happened to him. However, they were distracted from their conversation by a loud knock on the door. The protagonist rose from his seat to meet the man standing behind the door. There he saw Waylay and Jamal in the company of a dark-skinned man with black hair, as well as 2 ferocious wolves. At that moment, John realized that in front of him was none other than the Wolf King Javier. In response, the man only chuckled, saying that most likely his wolves had given away his identity. He wanted to give John credit, because few people remain calm in his presence. John looked at the ferocious wolves, and Javier said he hoped his pets weren't bothering him too much. In response, the hero simply indifferently asked the man why he had come here. However, Javier smiled broadly and said that John most likely already knew why he had come. And yet the main character pretended not to understand anything and asked the man to enlighten him. The first thing Javier noticed was that this farm was pretty good, all things considered. He explained that he meant that a woman with a child cannot do all things. But then John suddenly showed up, and in just a few weeks, rebuilt the place from scratch. The protagonist still pretended not to understand what the Wolf King was talking about. He noted that John was amazing. He somehow found time to fix everything here, commit murder and steal his cows. John wanted to object, saying that they were his cows. But instead of a normal answer, Javier simply spat at his feet. He explained that the cows were in the wolf's den, and everything in the den belonged to him. In fact, Javier was somehow sure that his level was lacking a woman and a boy. He asked John with a grin if he knew where he could find a similar pair. Instead of answering, the protagonist pushed him in the chest with all his might, causing the man to fall on his back. Then he jumped to his feet next to his wolves and declared that it was quite brave. In response, the main character said that he would now show him what courage was, but suddenly Ellie intervened in their quarrel. She turned to the Wolf King and asked him to stop and leave them alone. This tearful request only made Javier laugh harder, as he was feeding his wolves raw meat at the time. He said that he was not particularly afraid to hear such words from a killer. Moreover, these were not just murderers, but the murderers of a man who had class. But Javier did not object to this. That man was a weakling. Hearing laughter about his subordinates, he immediately shouted at them, saying that last time he had to drag their burnt souls off the pole. As soon as Whale and Jamal heard this, they immediately stopped laughing and apologized to their boss. Meanwhile, Ellie approached the Wolf King and pressed both hands against his chest, intending to show how strong she was. Jamal wanted to defend his boss, but he stopped him there. Instead, he turned to the girl and said they had 3 days to return his cows and get off the farm. John stood up for the girl and asked the Wolf King what would happen if they did not fulfill these conditions. In response, the man snapped his fingers and said that his wolves were hungry after a long hike in the mountains, and then they would know how hungry they were. The protagonist only replied with a smile that he could become quite tough food. Javier noted that he liked John. He was a brave man, but whether he was an imperial knight or not, this valley was his, and it would always be so. After this, he put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled loudly, calling his subordinates to him. The men immediately ran up to Javier, after which they all turned around and walked away. When they left, John asked Ellie what had gotten into her, and she replied that she was simply fed up with people like this guy. At this moment, the main character realized that it looked like he would have to stay here longer and settle this situation with the bandits. When things calmed down a bit, the 3 of them returned to the house, and John began reading a book. Ellie was still worried that Javier had given them a 3-day deadline, but the protagonist didn't care much. He said that there are 2 categories of people in the world: those who fear what is beyond their control, and those who simply do not. Wolf King Javier was a powerful man, and he had many strong people under his command. But he still came for some futile chase after cows, showing that he belonged to the first category. In any case, it didn't matter to John. Suddenly the system sent him a notification that his doom points had dropped by 1, and the apocalypse was retreating. It was getting on for sunset, and John went to the garden to sow some plants there. When he looked towards the house, he saw that several uninvited guests were gathered there. When he approached, he saw the headman, who introduced him to another man. It was Gottfried Fulk. Gottfried was a merchant who was in charge of a caravan heading to their town, and he then introduced the man to John, the new owner of the farm. The main character didn't understand why this Gottfried was looking at him like that. Moreover, he looked damn familiar. As soon as the man heard the main character's name, he immediately froze in place and for some time could not utter a word. He just stood there and looked at him with an admiring face, while John himself looked at Ellie with displeasure. He offered to show John the cheese they supplied to the city. He would like to know his opinion. The girl still tried to give up this idea, but John asked to do it just once for his sake, and for the sake of how much he worked on this cellar. The girl eventually agreed, but said that John still owed her a debt. After this, the 2 of them went to the cellar with the headman, and the main character remained with Gottfried. John was extremely displeased, and looked at the man angrily, clearly realizing who was in front of him. Suddenly the man fell to his knees and began to apologize to the protagonist, bowing to the eternal flame. He looked at John, whose entire body was enveloped in magical fire. The protagonist looked sternly at Gottfried and asked him who sent him here. He said that no one sent him. He came here unintentionally and asked to spare him. He recognized John because he saved him. At the Battle of the Hirth Hills, John freed him from the mage, something Gottfried tried to forget because he considered it blasphemy to look at him. But John only ordered him to get up and shut up. No one in the valley should know who he was, and if anyone found out about it, it would be the old man's fault. He also said that only a dead man knows the name of the eternal flame, and asked the man if he understood why he was still alive. It so happened that he needed a man who could bring him what could not be obtained here, and since Gottfried knew his little secret, he would be that man. The man hoped that this was a holy mission for him, but the protagonist quickly dispelled his suspicions. However, in order not to upset the old man, he still said that this was truly a holy mission. Hearing this, the man immediately shouted in delight that he hoped that his personal fire would burn forever. At that moment, Ellie approached them, accidentally overheard their conversation, and asked why they were talking about the eternal flame. The men turned sharply in her direction, and realized that they had to somehow get out of the situation. Gottfried explained that the eternal flame was his hero, whom he had never met personally, and therefore knew nothing about, but he believed that everything would be purified by its light. Ellie clearly didn't like these words. She said that his hero was a man who killed millions of civilians. A serious argument began to flare up between them, and then John decided to intervene to change the subject, since this topic touched on very delicate issues. In the end, the girl said that because of this eternal flame, she lost her family. By that time, the headman had already returned to them with a plate in his hands and offered the boys some cheese. He noted that the cheese was really good. Then the main character looked at Gottfried and invited him to try the cheese first. The man obediently walked over to the plate Jonas was holding and took a piece of cheese to try. The headman immediately looked at the old man with a smile and asked him what he thought about the taste of this cheese. He enthusiastically declared that he had never tasted anything more delicious in his life. The texture and taste of this cheese were simply incredible. He said he just had to try more, but Ellie asked him not to make things up, as it was just ordinary cheese. John said Ellie makes it, and if he wants to try some really good cheese, he should come back next year. They make a lot of cheddar. The man was absolutely delighted to hear this, and said he had never tried cheddar before. John explained that Gottfried was an uncultured man, or that he was simply exaggerating, and then said that he would need to go on business. Finally, he asked the old man to behave decently, and not to talk too much. As soon as John left, the old man immediately began asking Ellie whether she thought she would sell this cheese. The girl said she had thought about it, although nothing would be ready this month, after which she was going to sell everything in the city. And then the old man suggested that they simply sell all this cheese to him personally instead. He stated that he was a kind of sign message. In his heyday, he loved soft, buttery mountain cheeses melted onto pieces of bread. Ellie didn't need to worry about softer cheeses, though. He was sure hers would have a fantastic, sharp, dry flavor once it had fully matured. It will be a big success even in small quantities, and they can present it as an exclusive, high-end product with a high price. Suddenly John came back and said that it sounded very interesting. But now they needed to get back to the garden, and he even had a list for the old man. The man began praising him again, saying that it was a great honor for him to deliver all this to him, and he would buy everything as soon as he returned to the city. Ellie noted that his behavior was quite disgusting. He must have really been crazy about the Imperial Knights. And then suddenly the headman suggested that they exchange a few words in private before he left. The girl agreed. She wanted to get away from this sycophant as soon as possible. When they had moved away, the girl asked the village chief why he had not told her about this before, to which he replied that he had been too absorbed in her cheese. He said that unfortunately another incident had occurred, and to Ellie's horror, it was another murder. This time, the shop owner who was rumored to have been harassing Ellie until John showed up and helped her, was killed. Now the deceased's husband, like all the other residents, thinks that Ellie was involved in the murder. The girl tried to object, but Jonas stopped her, putting his hand on her shoulder. He said he believed it was the work of her friend John Sutton. Ellie immediately tried to defend Jonas, saying that he wouldn't do such a thing, but Jonas laughed at her for believing that. He then said that he could protect her if only she would let him do so. But in response, the girl only hit him on the hand and said that he should leave. The man did not insist. He raised his hands and moved away from her to a safe distance. However, he wanted Ellie to know that his personal mission was to find the witch who was responsible for everything that was happening. And when he catches her, there will be no mercy. Only a public execution will satisfy him. He explained that the situation would not change even if Ellie turned out to be the witch. At this time, the main character and Gottfried were also talking. The man did not understand why this girl was there. At first, John didn't understand what he was talking about. The man explained that the girl was clearly angry at the eternal flame, so he didn't understand what she was doing there. However, John replied that she had every right to be angry with him after everything he had done to her. The man still didn't understand John a little, since he was the one who did all this. And then the main character suddenly grabbed him by the clothes, and once again ordered him to shut up. He lifted him off the ground, and then the old man began to apologize frantically and promised not to do it again. But John was not convinced. He said that these were just empty words from a weakling. He said the old man would never understand him. He would never know what it was like to lose everything he had in an instant. When John looks inside himself, he knows there is emptiness there, a fire burning everything, and he lives knowing that he is willing to do almost anything to feed it. The old man apologized again and said that John was right. All he knew was how to sell, nothing more, nothing less. Then the hero let him go and said that from now on they would only discuss what he understood. However, at that moment, Ellie and Jonas approached them and said that they were ready to discuss business. Seeing the girl's face, John asked her if everything was okay. He assumed that she was worried about what they had talked about with the headman. However, the girl explained that everything was fine. They were just discussing the logistics of cheese production, and she decided on something. Ellie came to the conclusion that since she was making the cheese, she would be responsible for its marketing. She then turned to Mr. Gottfried, declaring that if he wanted to cooperate with her, he would have to follow her terms. She knew he wanted to sell a small amount of product at an inflated price, but his strategy conflicted with her values, so they would do what she decided. Hearing this, the men froze, not knowing what to answer. The old man noted that this girl was very hot-tempered, like a real spark. Now he understood why John liked her. He eventually agreed to her terms and stated that he respected her decision, after which he said goodbye to Ms. Sutton. The girl immediately blushed and quickly explained to the man that she and John were not married, but he no longer listened to them. Together with the headman, they went back to the city, saying goodbye to the main character and Ellie. The hero thought to himself that perhaps he should just squash this merchant so that he wouldn't cause any problems. Ellie heard him muttering something under his breath, but the hero said that everything was fine. After that, he changed the topic and noted that the sunset today was very beautiful, and the apocalypse meanwhile was approaching. He gained one more doom point. Soon after, the girl headed back into the house to wash the dishes. She couldn't get the fact that the merchant had called her Miss Sutton out of her head. She admitted that she even liked the idea, but John was still loyal to the eternal flame, so she simply couldn't be with him. Just at that moment, the hero entered the house, greeted Ellie, and the girl asked him how things were going with the garden. He said all 25 acres were planted, 20 acres were wheat, and the rest were several crops he was checking. He asked the girl if she knew how much yield to expect from 1 acre, and she suggested that he read about it in his book. It said that the average yield per acre was between 25 and 85 bushels. And then suddenly he noticed that Ellie had something on her cheek, and he hurried to remove the dirt. The girl blushed and said that she could remove it herself, but it would not be difficult for John to do it at all. At some point they froze in place and just looked at each other. And yet John recoiled. He knew it was wrong, considering he was deceiving her. To change the subject, he asked why 1 bushel was equal, and the girl said that they used a large barrel from the barn to measure it. The point is that it shows how much can fit in a barrel. For example, a bushel of fruit will be different from a bushel of corn. After this, Ellie invited the hero to try her cookies, and he noted that they were incredibly delicious. Suddenly Ben burst into the house and announced that he had found wolf tracks nearby. However, he suddenly fell silent when he saw John eating cookies because his sister said that they were already finished. As soon as the boys heard this, they immediately grabbed all the last cookies and quickly stuffed them into their mouths. Then they looked at the boy as if nothing had happened and said that there really was nothing left. Ben realized that he was being brazenly deceived and could not contain his anger. Suddenly he saw 1 cookie that was left lying on the table and was already getting ready to grab it. However, his sister was faster. She took the cookie and stuffed it into John's mouth, saying that it was for him since he worked harder than anyone else. However, the boy did not like this, because he also worked and even fed the horse every day. The protagonist decided to change the subject and ask the boy about the tracks he had spoken about. But in response, the boy only turned away and declared that without cookies, he would not tell anything. Well, John had a better argument. He said that if there was no information about the tracks, then Ben would not get the candy. As soon as the boy saw the sweets, he also began to jump for joy and was ready to tell about those tracks. Then the hero gave him the long-awaited bag of candy and asked the boy to go wash up, and then they would all look at the tracks together. When Ben left, John turned to Ellie and decided to talk to her about the murders. He decided that they needed to try on the role of detectives to clear their names, but the girl didn't even know where to start. She wasn't sure that people would believe them. But it was still worth a try, so she decided to try to put together a list of suspects and perhaps motives. Javier was the prime candidate. John noted that it was a good idea and that she should work on it while he looked at the tracks Ben had mentioned. The boy said that he had once set larger traps, and when he checked them today, he saw many tracks that were clearly no more than a day old. However, then the boy suddenly changed the subject, as he was very interested in something. He asked the main character if he and his older sister had any kind of relationship. John pretended not to understand what Ben was talking about, but Ben didn't pursue the topic further. He pointed to the traps he had left and said that the place was right here. John remarked that the design was indeed good, and Ben explained that Ellie had given him the basics, and he had figured out the rest on his own. Then the main character said that first they would check the tracks, and then he would show him how to make even better traps. Soon after, the two of them headed deeper into the forest. On the way, the main character asked the boy if he really wasn't afraid of Javier. In response, Ben just chuckled and said that he wasn't afraid at all. However, he suddenly accidentally stepped on a twig, and it crunched under his foot. The boy immediately became scared and hid behind the main character, thinking that it was a wolf that was hunting them. But John quickly reassured him, saying it was just a small stick. The boy was clearly unhappy, but he pretended that it didn't frighten him at all. He laughed it off. saying that he had behaved in such a way so that John would not relax. Soon they reached a small clearing, in which there were many tracks that Ben had spoken about. After this, he demanded to give him more sweets, but John asked him not to get used to this, since he did not have any more sweets. When he looked at the tracks, he realized there were 4 wolves, and they definitely belonged to Javier. He suggested building them a huge trap that could catch the quarry. However, the main character replied that, unfortunately, he was too smart for that, so nothing would work. He said they had done a lot of ambushes in the war, and John was only alive because an old hunter had taught him how to build traps. With their help, he was able to save his life countless times, and now he decided to use them too. John found it hard to believe that this part of the valley had remained untouched during the war. Everything here was so calm, as if it were another planet. And then suddenly a whole flock of birds flew right over their heads, screaming very loudly, attracting attention. John noted with a smile that perhaps he had been hasty in concluding that this place was especially peaceful. He took a knife out of his pocket, preparing for the upcoming battle. After that, he extended his hand to Ben to take him home, since he had a couple of wolves here that he needed to catch. Soon after, the protagonist returned back to the farm. It was already the 3rd day of his agreement with Javier, and so he was going to inspect the perimeter. He took with him many tools that would help him in his fight against the Wolf King. Ben was very surprised when he saw the contents of the bag. He did not understand where John could have hidden all this. He also asked him to let him support the sword, but the hero told him to hold it with both hands, as it was heavy. The thing is that it was a long sword, often used by knights or armored infantry, and Lipiera and Alera also have them. Most knights never use daggers, but John believed that they were sometimes many times more useful than swords. Then he asked Ben if he knew what was better than 1 dagger. The boy replied that he was right. The only thing better than that could be 2 daggers. After this, the hero headed towards the exit, asking his brother and sister to stay here. He also left Ellie a knife for self-defense. The boy didn't understand why they didn't give him a knife either, but John said that he could cause a lot of trouble with a simple hammer. Finally, he asked them to make sure that all the windows were closed, and he himself promised to return quite quickly. The main character looked up at the sky and realized that today was a full moon. Everything indicated that today was a special day. Meanwhile, Javier and his guys were already heading to the meeting place to settle scores with this guy. One of his subordinates, Rosalie, asked if he really needed all this clamor to deal with one farmer. In response, Javier yelled at the girl, reminding her that this farmer had class. However, the girl still did not understand why they should be afraid because of a small, pathetic knight. But Javier said that appearances were deceiving, since John had defeated the entire whale gang, including Jamal. But Rosalie thought they could handle this guy with their hands tied. But Jamal was a piece of trash. He couldn't handle a guy like that. But before the big guy could object, the girl kissed him on the cheek, saying that she didn't mean anything bad. Then Javier said that John killed that guy with class and threw one of their best fighters right off the cliff. There was no need to underestimate him. Meanwhile, the protagonist watched them from a tree. Javier, apparently, believed that John was to blame. Perhaps this excluded him from the list of suspects. However, he had heard enough. Now he needed to find a more suitable place to fight, since there were too many bushes here. John himself would like to burn everything here to the ground, but then they will definitely understand that he is the eternal flame. At that moment, one of the wolves noticed the movement and immediately barked somewhere to the side. Javier immediately tensed up, but Jamal assumed it was just a squirrel. Rosalie was fed up with this boredom, so she decided to explore everything on her own. But Javier asked her not to contact this guy alone if she found him. Apparently, the girl had no intention of listening to him, and this made the Wolf King very angry. The big guy asked him if the boss was sure that he should leave her alone because she would die, but Javier said that in that case he would kill him himself. Meanwhile, the main character came out into a fairly large clearing where there was nothing superfluous. And then he suddenly felt someone's trace of mana that was floating in the air. Apparently, it was from a person who had a class. John immediately took out his weapon and prepared for the upcoming fight. When he looked up, he saw Rosalie sitting on a branch, who greeted the young man with a smile. She stated that John was quite difficult to find, considering that he was an ordinary farmer. The hero assumed that she was in league with the Wolf King, and the girl did not deny it. She said she knew a John whom she had cut up and thrown to the wolves, and the hero noted that John was a fairly common name in those parts. But now the girl didn't care what her enemy's name was, since he would die anyway. Without waiting for an answer, she threw her knife at him. The main character managed to dodge in time, so the weapon flew over his head. And yet the blade managed to graze his cheek. But this only made John even more excited. He clearly liked the speed of this girl. Rosalie stated that she liked men who could compete with her, and asked John if he was one of them. However, without waiting for an answer from him, she asked if he was not going to show her his swords. The hero simply calmly replied that there was absolutely no need for that. But apparently Rosalie insisted, because she had already shown her knives, and it would be rude of him not to respond in kind. Since she insisted so much, the protagonist finally took out his sword. Then Rosalie said that Javier actually wanted to deal with him himself, but she didn't like to share. John noted that this was quite sad, since it was a bad idea to risk his life for other people's cows. Immediately after this, he jumped from his seat and rushed to attack the girl. He attacked her with his longsword, but Rosalie blocked his blow with 2 blades. Apparently, she really enjoyed this battle and got real pleasure from it. Literally the next moment, she simply disappeared from the place where she had just stood. John immediately began looking around, trying to figure out where the girl had disappeared to. He managed to jump to the side in time because he felt Rosalie's knife flying towards him. She began to jump away from tree trunks with lightning speed, trying to attack the main character from different sides. It seemed as if she had summoned several clones of herself, and now John had to figure out which Rosalie was the real one. The clones continued to attack him, and the hero had no choice but to deal with them one by one. With deft blows of his longsword, he deflected the throwing knives that flew in his direction. However, at that moment, the real Rosalie was right behind him. The girl gently placed her hand on the protagonist's shoulder and invited him to dance with her. Instead of answering, John turned around and hit the place where she was standing with all his might, saying that she could lose her arm like that. He noted to himself that he felt as if he had lost his grip, but not completely. So he deftly stood with one hand on the hilt of his sword, thereby avoiding the blows of the throwing knives. Rosalie's clones continued to circle around him, and John couldn't help but notice that this girl must be of high rank to be so fast. He knew he would never hit her if he watched her, but it was entirely possible to sense her mana. So he decided to focus on the sensations and closed his eyes. When Rosalie saw this, she became furious and ordered him to open his eyes immediately, because she had prepared for so long before meeting him. She deployed all of her clones to attack the protagonist, who was still balancing on one hand. When the right moment finally came, he suddenly pulled his sword out of the ground, grabbed it with both hands, and attacked the girl sharply. While he was dealing with her clones, he realized that he could easily kill her, but he decided not to. Instead, he struck the girl in the stomach with his spear, sending her flying backwards. It was not a fatal blow, as John did not want to give the sheriff any more reason to suspect him of the murders. Suddenly, he noticed sounds coming from the forest, and when he looked back, he saw a group of people approaching him. He looked at the defeated Rosalie with a smirk, saying that she apparently didn't make it in time, since her boss was already here. As it turned out, the Wolf King Javier really did come for the main character. He said he was very glad to see John, but he had not seen anything of what he owed him, and asked again where his cows were. However, he was also interested in where that girl Ellie and her brother Ben were. John replied that any decent bandit in his place would be worried about his friend whose lungs he had just punctured, not about the cows. But Javier declared that Rosalie was no longer his friend. She was just a tamed dog. Despite the insults, the injured girl tried to warn her boss about the danger, but he only told her to shut up. Javier promised Rosalie that he would definitely punish her when he dealt with this guy. He then turned to Mr. Sutton again, asking if he knew exactly how he had acquired his title. Then he suddenly raised his head and began to roar like a wolf, and his pack began to gather around him. However, in response, John simply said that he didn't care at all. Instead, he activated his skill, and suddenly his hand began to glow brightly, and his weapon was engulfed in flames. When Rosalie saw this, she was horrified. She had no idea that he had such a weapon in his arsenal all this time. It was a magitechnical shield, which was impossible, since the last war was fought for it, and the only person who knew how to make them was dead. Any class could wear such a shield. It was powered by a mana stone. It was an item of great rarity. But for Javier, this was only more interesting. He said that he would definitely tear this shield from John's cold, dead hands. After this, he ordered his wolves to attack him. The protagonist noted that he hated hitting dogs, but now he was simply left with no choice. He threw the wolves away from himself in different directions, using his weapon and his legs. Suddenly, one of the animals was right behind him, ready to stab him in the neck. But John reacted instantly. He turned sharply and hit the wolf back with his fiery fist. Meanwhile, Rosalie managed to get to her feet and walk towards the forest. Her ribs were literally burning, and she wanted to hide while no one was paying attention to her. But right at that moment, Javier appeared behind her and gloomily asked the girl where she was going. He grabbed her by the face and repeated his order again. For all the mongrels, she also had to go on the attack. Meanwhile, the main character continued to deal with the wolves, using his daggers for this. While he was stabbing one of the wolves, one of Javier's men suddenly attacked him with a knife from behind. The protagonist easily pulled the knife out of his back and noted that his opponent's broken ribs did not seem to stop him. He turned around and saw Javier hiding behind Rosalie, and noted that it was quite cowardly of him. The girl continued to scream and beg the boss for mercy, but he continued to hold her tightly by the neck. But John was not satisfied with this state of affairs. He turned around and rushed sharply at the Wolf King, because this was their battle. Javier realized he had no choice but to take the hit, so he threw Rosalie to the ground. As soon as their weapons clashed, he began to taunt John, wondering if that was all he could do. He stated that he would need something better, and then began waving the weapon in his hands. At that moment, Rosalie rose to her feet and prepared to attack John from behind, while her boss held him down from the front. Thus, they made a simultaneous attack, but the protagonist blocked their blows from both sides. He was surprised that Rosalie would express gratitude like that, but the girl said that she didn't need to thank him for her broken ribs. However, John said that he meant that he saved her life. At that moment, Javier struck the spot where the protagonist had just been standing, but he managed to jump aside along with Rosalie. When they landed, he declared that he had already saved her life twice today. But Javier was still determined. He prepared to run, since letting John go was not in his plans. He ran at full speed and, together with his wolves, ran after the main character. However, he only told him that if he tames animals, this does not mean that he should start behaving like them. Javier was angered by these words and intended to take revenge on John for them. But John reminded him that he had already said that the dish would turn out quite tough. He delivered a powerful fire blow straight to the Wolf King's face, then threw him aside. He threw it right at his pack of wolves, causing them all to fall to the grass along with their leader. Meanwhile, Rosalie and Jamal watched what was happening from the sidelines, deciding not to interfere. Looking at the corpses of the wolves, the girl noted that this guy John was just as crazy as Javier. She suggested that the big guy leave since they wouldn't be able to defeat him. But the man said that a real bandit would never abandon his comrades. Meanwhile, Javier did not give up on his attempts to attack the protagonist and threw his weapon at him. He managed to hit the protagonist's hand right away, and thus he chained it and tied it to a tree branch. After that, he took his second weapon, and while running, spinning it, began to approach John. However, he did not take into account how strong John was. He easily tore off the tree to which his hand was attached. He used a huge tree trunk as a weapon, and began swinging it around, thereby throwing the annoying Javier away from him. The man received a strong blow to the stomach, causing him to cough loudly and barely able to stand on his feet. Then the main character finally freed himself from the tree, walked up to him and said with a grin that he had been a good boy. After that, he threw him his weapon and said that he dropped the stick, after which he asked him to bring it, as if he were a dog. In response, Javier only sighed in displeasure. Apparently this whole situation made him furious. He laughed wildly and said it was impressive. No one in all his years had ever survived that long to see his favorite trick. After this, the man rose to his feet, and a strange purple aura enveloped his body, and the remaining wolves began to approach him. The protagonist realized that it was his mana. He fed it to his wolves. He must have been a high-level tamer. Then Javier ordered his wolves to act, and without a second thought they rushed straight at John. Animals began to surround the protagonist, and soon deprived him of the ability to move normally. The wolves began to surround John from all sides. They grabbed him with their sharp jaws by all his limbs. Soon both his arms and legs were captured by the wolves, and he couldn't even move normally. But he still had his fire skill ready, and he reminded the wolves once again that he had asked them not to bite. Then Javier said with a grin that even if he could tear those teeth off his leg, the wolves would explode along with him. The thing is, Javier gave the wolves more mana than their bodies could handle. This force literally tore them apart from the inside, so they wanted John like their favorite toy, to somehow get rid of the pain. If he opened their jaws, the wolf would simply explode. But if John allowed them to continue, they would gnaw him right to the bone. Now only John could choose which ending he would get. The hero realized that Javier was using them as living bombs. But in all his war years, he had never seen anything more absurd than this. The hero understood that he could easily resolve this situation. But if he incinerated these parasites, he would reveal the fact that he was the eternal flame. He then stated that since Javier had over-siphoned his wolf mana, he himself was now incredibly weakened. But the man just laughed and said that John was definitely not in a position to call him a weakling. However, he noted that it would still be amusing for him to watch his wolves tear him to pieces. However, the Wolf King had unfinished business, so he went back into the forest, still regretting that John had not simply returned the cows to him. He headed back to the camp, calling Jamal to him along the way. He ordered the big guy to clean up the guy's remains when it was all over. After that, he headed into the woods, and the big guy watched him go. After which he told John that he couldn't believe he had forced the boss to resort to this. To be honest, Javier sometimes scared the hell out of him. He couldn't understand what kind of person could do that to his dogs. However, he asked the protagonist not to worry, and promised him to finish quickly. John realized that apparently he couldn't do without witnesses, but he knew that he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to take the mana from these animals. So he touched one of the wolves with his fiery hand, burning him severely. After this, the wolf recoiled from him, but no explosion occurred. He simply flew to the side as all the mana from his body was sucked out by the main character. Jamal watched what was happening in horror. He could not believe that some simple old farmer was capable of such a thing. And then he realized that in front of him was not just a farmer, but a real magician. Then John apologized to him, but now he would have to make sure that Jamal didn't spill his little secrets. In response, the big guy simply firmly stated that he was no longer afraid of monsters. The thing is, Even if John takes his life, he'll at least be able to fight a mage who has the blood of millions of people on his hands. After that, he swung his huge axe at him, intending to take revenge on this hellish devil. He launched a powerful blow straight at John, but he blocked it with his shield. The man said that that girl Ellie was definitely a witch, since she continued to live with a monster like John. His fist was so strong that the protagonist had a hard time holding it back, but he still managed to do it. At the right moment, he turned sharply and kicked the man right in the knee, knocking him off his feet. From such an incredibly strong blow, Jamal fell to his knees and was no longer able to fight. Then the main character approached him and gloomily declared that he should not dare to involve Ellie in these matters. He then ordered the big man to stand up so that he could execute him properly. But the man only became more enraged. He stood up abruptly, screamed loudly, and raised his weapon again to attack. But this time too, the main character managed to block it with just his palm. Moreover, he used his skill to destroy the enemy's weapon and completely disable it. Then Jamal declared that he might be a worthless bandit, but at least he was not an evil and cruel warmonger. At that moment, the force of the protagonist's fire began to incinerate the big guy's weapon. He looked in horror at his melted axe, which could no longer serve as his weapon. Immediately after this, John rushed towards him, hoping that the man had finally finished his monologue. With one deft movement, he cut the man's body in half, giving him no chance of survival. After this, Jamal fell dead on the grass, and a huge fountain of blood gushed from his wounds. At that moment, the hero realized that he could not feel Javier's aura, and now he wondered where this tamer had disappeared to. And then suddenly he realized that Javier apparently was heading to the farm. John couldn't even describe in words what he was going to do to him if he harmed Ellie or Ben. In this case, the hero had no intention of leaving anything but ashes, and suddenly a notification informed him that his doom points had increased by as much as 5 points. Immediately after this, the hero activated his skill and ran with all his might to the farm. At some point he stopped and decided to look at her from afar. Apparently the farm was quiet. There were no signs that Javier had already arrived there. Nevertheless, the hero still used his skill to get to the farm as quickly as possible and check if everything was okay with his comrades. Suddenly, Ferdy the bull, who was standing nearby, noticed the approaching man and suddenly tensed up. His eyes blazed with fire, and he assumed a threatening pose, intending to defend the farm from intruders. At that moment, John stopped, waved his hand at the bull, and let him know that it was him and not some enemy. When the bull saw John, he immediately calmed down and came up to him to pet him. The hero asked him if anyone had come here, but the bull shook his head. Then the protagonist thanked him for protecting the farm. But now that he was back, Ferdy could go and rest. As soon as the bull heard this, he headed into the pen, and much to John's surprise, he managed to open the gate on his own. At that moment, John realized that he really needed to be more careful about what this guy was eating. After that, he went into the house, knocked on the door and asked Ellie if she was okay. The girl unlocked the door when she realized it was John, and told him that they had blocked the door from intruders. The main character immediately got to his feet and asked the girl if she was hurt. She said that everything was fine, and Ben was now sleeping. However, it seemed to her that John himself was not well. Although he tried to stay on his feet, his condition was clearly serious. Suddenly, he fell to his knees and began to cough loudly, which greatly frightened Ellie. His eyes were filled with fire. Apparently his power had suddenly awakened, so he asked the girl to return to the house immediately. Despite this, Ellie wanted to help him, but John insisted that he was fine and that she needed to leave. He explained that his mana was burning him and he got really sick if he used too much of it. He needed to catch his breath for a bit. In the end, the girl left him alone, and then the main character was able to come to his senses in the fresh air. Soon after, Ben looked out of the house, glad that John had finally returned. He started asking if he had managed to defeat the Wolf King, but John said that he should be in bed now. He didn't let the boy finish, and instead firmly directed him back to his room. Although Ben was a little offended, he still listened to the main character and headed back to his place. Soon Ellie came out to him. She assumed that John was still in pain, but he said that it was almost all over. Then the girl offered him some tea, and John did not refuse. He refused to let her add anything sweet to his tea, and the girl decided in that case not to touch his bucket of honey. He thought that by fighting Javier and his guys, he would keep them safe and also let off some steam. But in the end, he only killed who knows who and, moreover, brought the apocalypse 2 steps closer. Now he was waiting for the fact that he needed to fence himself off from everyone in order to leave here before he burned everything down again. He wondered if he would return, when he would leave, and how long Ellie and Ben would be able to fight him. The main character understood that he was deceiving himself. Wherever he went, he would only cause problems. Meanwhile, the girl had already prepared a cup of tea for Mr. Gloomy. She said that looking at the stars had always helped her, and perhaps he should try it too, after which she pointed out the constellation Orion to the hero. Her grandmother once told me that the great hunter Orion taught them to follow their desires. John noted that her grandmother was a wise woman, and then asked what made this Orion so great. According to legend, this great hunter never missed his prey, and the Big Dipper, the oldest bear in the forest, used her strength to survive. Ellie added that her grandmother was very wise. She often said that the world speaks to a person in secret ways, and one just needs to learn to listen to them. Then John asked her if this meant that her grandmother knew how to hear, but did not teach it to her granddaughter. But the girl immediately objected and said that her grandmother taught her. She taught her to care for plants, to read both letters and runes, and she also taught her to be wary of strange men. She started a lot for Ellie, but the girl lost her on the day the village burned to the ground. That day, Grandma didn't have a chance. The roof collapsed, pinning her to the ground. The eternal flame appeared without warning, and no evacuation of civilians in the city took place. The grandmother tried her best to save her granddaughter and begged her to just run away from there. On that day, the eternal flame showed everyone in one instant what true destruction is. Before Ellie could do anything, the fire had already engulfed her grandmother's body and burned her to ashes. That day, the girl lost the rest of her family. But the main character didn't need to be told this, since he was personally there that day, and saw everything with his own eyes. As one of the few survivors, Ellie still couldn't believe she was still alive. She knew that John must be familiar with loss, being an Imperial Knight. Then she asked him what the eternal flame was really like, and he replied that it was very strong and terrifying. But he still couldn't help but add that at the same time he was also broken. Ellie noted that in this they were similar. She didn't know much about John, but she knew that he could be a killer. But she understood that everything was more complicated than it seemed. Her grandmother always said that soldiers were not murderers, but simple cogs in a destroyed machine. Orion hunted for honor and sport, and Ursa Major fought for her life, but her grandmother taught her that they both deserved respect. Then Ellie suddenly decided to ask John if he had any family left that he missed, and he replied that he had a brother. The girl asked if they were close and what happened to him, to which John replied that they were indeed close, but now his brother lives very far away. Ellie said she was sure he would have been delighted to receive a simple letter to let him know his brother was alive and well. But, unfortunately, the hero replied that this was impossible, since his brother was too far away to write letters. After this, the girl decided to leave him alone with his thoughts until the morning. John noted that his life has been nothing but battles since birth, and he could learn from the Big Dipper to harm others only for the sake of preserving himself and his loved ones. John assumed he could find a way to fight for his desires without resorting to killing. The question, however, was what he really wanted from this life. The next day, the protagonist decided to continue Ellie's training and became her opponent in a staged knife fight. The girl tried her best and tried to hit the man. However, he did not give in to her and easily dodged her blows. Ellie kept making awkward and incorrect movements, which is why John constantly caught her making mistakes. However, the protagonist asked her not to worry about mistakes, as he was now using a trick attack. He noted that Ellie had made great progress. She was almost ready to meet the eternal flame, but the girl asked him not to coddle her. She wouldn't be able to live with herself if she didn't at least try to avenge them, to inflict even a little bit of the pain that the eternal fire made them go through. And then perhaps the personal fire will understand what she has done, and will never harm anyone like that again in her life. Then John suggested that perhaps he already understood everything, but the girl flatly refused to believe it. John himself should understand this, because he himself worked for this tyrant. The man said that in order to survive terrible things, we lie to ourselves about what we need to do and don't realize we're stuck. Ellie agreed with his statement and said that it was actually just an illusion. He should accept the truth, and then he would be free. John himself didn't understand what he was doing at all. He couldn't continue to lie about himself. But if he told everything, then everything would come to an end. But Ellie distracted him from his thoughts by asking John to wash up first before breakfast. As soon as the main character heard about the food, he immediately ran back to the house. He looked out the window and noticed Ben digging in the ground in the backyard. He asked him to stop, but the boy didn't even hear him. Then Ellie suddenly asked John if he was planning to go outside the farm in a few days. She thought she could buy a couple of chickens. She knew a kind old lady called Widow Brown. She lived just outside the city. Ben was old enough to look after the chicken coop, and she could use some help with the bugs in the garden. So John agreed to take her there that day. Soon they had the cart ready, and finally the hero asked the bull Ferdy to guard the farm and keep an eye on Ben. However, Ellie didn't understand why this bull started to behave so strangely. After some time, they arrived at the right place outside the city, where the same Widow Brown was located. John noted the construction around her house and suggested she was preparing for war. But Ellie said she was just not a fan of visitors. She decided to take charge of the negotiations, after which she walked up to the door and knocked gently. Soon the door slowly swung open. An old woman with dark, swarthy skin, fluffy white hair and strange glasses looked out from there. But as soon as she realized that her old friend Ellie was standing in front of her, she immediately smiled and said that she was very glad to see her. But the stranger who arrived with her confused her, so she immediately pointed a spear at him. John hastened to justify himself by saying that he was an ordinary farmer. John remembered Ellie saying she was a sweet old lady, and she said she really was the only one who had ever been kind to her. She explained to Old Lady Brown that John was not dangerous, and that he used to serve the eternal flame, but no longer did. The hero confirmed these words, declaring that he was retired. Now he was a simple farmer, and he had left the war forever. The girl told the old woman that she didn't need to bother him any longer, since they had actually come to chat about chickens. Brown noted that in that case they arrived just in time. She hoped to sell her chickens before the caravan left. She also said there was another murder. It was Peter, the rancher with the ranger's bow. His body was mutilated and unrecognizable. It was terribly painful for the old woman to leave everything that she and her husband had started here. But with the way things were going here, no one was safe here. The old woman also asked Ellie to think about leaving with her, but the girl said that for now she only wanted to buy a couple of chickens. Brown said she would give 5 gold pieces for the whole dozen and another gold piece for the rooster, but for Ellie this was a huge price. But the old woman still insisted, because for one trip to the capital they take 1 gold coin, which was real robbery on the part of the eternal flame. The hero wanted to say that it was not the eternal flame that set the taxes, but the old woman immediately shut him up and said that he did not protect him in her presence. In the end, the protagonist decided not to argue with her and took out gold to pay for the chickens. The old woman immediately took the coins from his palm and declared that the chickens would be theirs if they could find them. The thing is, chickens are always running off somewhere. For example, Sigvald loved the top of the roof. That was all she knew. Then the old woman invited Ellie to come over for tea and leave this matter to this strong guy. The main character had no choice but to accept the task, in which he had to find chickens. Soon he found one of the 12 chickens. Then the search continued, and John noted that the Widow Brown had a keen eye, so he would be catching chickens without his abilities. However, he understood that in that case it would be quite a hassle. After some time, he was able to catch another chicken. Meanwhile, Ellie and the Widow Brown watched this entire process from the window of the old woman's house. After some time, the main character was able to catch as many as 8 chickens out of 12. As he put the 11th chicken into the pen, he began to wonder where the last one might be. Then he looked up and saw the silhouette of a chicken right on the roof of the building. The bird looked at him defiantly, as if it was not John who was hunting it, but the other way around. The protagonist decided to use the ladder to reach the roof, although he would have preferred to charge his mana and jump up there instead. He slowly tried to get closer to the chicken, which kept retreating to the edge. When John tried to grab it, the bird jumped up sharply and began pecking at him. The chicken grabbed it with its clawed feet and began pecking at it with its sharp beak. The bird then jumped down and John fell with it, clearly unhappy with having to deal with all this. However, he had no choice, so he ran after the last bird. He ran after her for so long that he eventually found himself in a small clearing in the middle of the forest, and then the bird finally stopped. The chicken looked at the protagonist with fury and spread its wings, as if threatening him. But John understood that now there were only the 2 of them here, so everything would be easier, after which he offered the chicken a mana stone. As soon as the bird saw the shiny stone, it immediately approached the hero and carefully sniffed it, after which it swallowed it. Eventually, the bird finally calmed down, and John was able to breathe out, thus completing the task. Now he wondered where they were and what that strange obelisk was near them. When he approached, he saw a small grave with Jenny's name on it, which had an emblem very similar to the one John himself had. At that moment, Brown came out of the forest, apparently waiting for John to find this grave. She explained that Jenny had given her body and soul to stop the war, and when she was finally sent home, there was barely anything left of her body. People said she should be grateful to the eternal flame for finally bringing peace. But Brown thought about how many people had died for it. John noted that it wasn't worth it, and he felt very sorry that her dead husband had been involved at all. At that moment, Ellie ran out of the forest, having finally found Old Lady Brown, but was clearly unhappy that she was bothering John again. But the hero said that he had just finished catching a chicken, and thought that it was worth buying more cows. After that, he shook the old woman's hand and said that she had helped them a lot. And finally the old woman asked him to take care of Ellie. They headed back. Ellie didn't understand why Brown was acting so strange at the end, and John suggested that maybe he reminded her of someone. In the evening, when the boys had already returned home, John began to draw up a plan of the premises. Ellie noted that he, as always, continues to work hard. She wondered what he was doing, and also said that he should grab Keller's cows before someone stole them too. Finally, the girl asked him not to stay long, and the man promised her that he would soon go to bed. After some time, he put out the candle and fell asleep right at the table. In his dream, he again saw people burned because of him, who accused him of having the blood of millions of people on his hands. At some point, John opened his eyes in horror, waking up in a cold sweat. He thought that even if he hated magicians, he had to do at least something right. With these thoughts, he ran out of the house and ran straight into the thick of the forest. There he found the entrance to the cave and, using a spell, destroyed the stones that blocked it. Then he walked up to one of the stone boxes and left a small mark on it. It didn't matter to him who the people he killed were. he was still going to honor the dead, because he was not inhuman. At that moment, one of the stone giants appeared from behind a large rock. He held in his hand one of the flowers they had given John earlier, and proudly showed it to the man. As always, they made an exchange, and the protagonist paid for this flower with 4 magic stones. After that, he took Jemal's coffin with him and jumped out of the cave, thinking that it was a suitable farewell gift. He soon found a suitable place where he could dig a grave for such a large coffin. After some time, everything was ready. A stone coffin stood nearby, and on the other side lay the skeleton of a big man and his burnt hammer. The main character walked up to his skeleton and carefully picked it up. After this, he placed the skeleton in a stone coffin, lowered it to the bottom of the pit, and covered it with a stone lid. When everything was ready, he dug the grave, installed the tombstone, and placed there the flower he had just bought from the stone giant. John spent the whole night near the grave and didn't even notice that the sun had already risen. When a bright light hit his eyes, he finally got to his feet and decided to chat about cows with old Keller. Meanwhile, Ellie had already begun her walk around the farm and approached Ferdy the bull. The thing is, she wanted to know his opinion on one issue. However, she realized that she looked stupid, since she knew that the bull would not understand anything. But she still decided to tell him that she wanted to leave. The thing is, something about Johnny was bothering her. She knew he was connected to the eternal flame, but perhaps he still continues to serve it. All this time he treated her only well, but still Ellie felt somehow uneasy. Widow Brown said that the Imperial Knights would always be loyal to Lepierre first and foremost. Ellie wasn't sure that anyone could just leave such a part of their life behind. She herself was absolutely sure that she still hadn't left her past behind. However, if you look at what John has already managed to do with this place, it only causes delight. At that moment, she was distracted from her thoughts by the mooing of a bull, who was reaching with all his might towards her bucket of greens. Ellie was still wondering whether she should go with the caravan to the capital, since the Widow Brown had already invited her. But she knew John would never accept that, because only the Widow Brown would like that option. She looked at her little brother, who was playing with the chickens, and suggested that maybe they could go away together. Meanwhile, the protagonist arrived at Keller's farm, who explained that he would give the cows for a small favor. There was a whole bunch of different ores in his mine, but they had to be reached somehow, and if John cleared the mine and brought him 10 gold worth of ore, he would give the cows for free. The hero asked if he had any equipment that could be used for the job, but Keller only had 1 bucket. He also explained that there was a lot of water there, and he hoped that John could hold his breath. He asked him to remember that if he died there, the value of his possessions would fall, and he intended to sell everything here before leaving. He also explained that to buy the entire farm, he would need about 15 gold, which was quite cheap, but he wouldn't be taking anything with him because of it. At this point, the hero received a task in which he had to mine ore worth 25 gold and buy his own cows and a farm. As he headed into the mine, Keller was completely sure that he would not return from there. Soon, John found himself waist-deep in water, unable to believe that Keller thought he could paddle his way out with just a bucket. So, without thinking twice, the main character used his skill to dry up all the water around. After this, the water in the mine disappeared. Only steam remained there, and now John was able to move forward without hindrance. Once inside the mine, he began to probe the stone walls in search of precious ores. When he found the right places, he simply broke them apart with his fist and took out the precious stones. Soon, he had collected a whole bucket of gold, and thought that this should definitely be enough. He quickly returned to Keller, who clearly didn't expect the guy to return, and so quickly. He couldn't believe that John had actually managed to get him the jewels, and so he gave him the cows and his entire farm without question. After this, the heroes saddled their horse and led the cows behind them, rejoicing that the mana crystals were such good bait for the animals. Meanwhile, Ellie looked out the window and was very surprised when she saw John there in the company of several cows. She went outside and said that there were many more cows here than she expected, and she didn't know what to do with them. However, John said he also plans to expand the barn and maybe even hire someone. But for now, there is enough space to house all the cows. The girl thought to herself that she had never seen anyone so determined to build an ordinary barn. John was determined to build the foundation for a solid farm, so that Ellie and her brother would never go hungry again. After that, he was going to leave, because he was nothing but trouble. But he still needed to somehow prevent bandits from raiding this farm. Meanwhile, Javier was walking through the forest. He noticed that everything here was burned to the ground and did not understand what had happened. He also wondered where his subject Jemal might be. At some point, he came across a grave with his name on it, and not far from it was his burnt axe. Javier couldn't believe that all this had really been done by that farmer John. At the same time, Ben suddenly ran into the house and called anxiously for his sister and Mr. Sutton. The protagonist immediately realized that such an appearance was not a good sign. Then the boy said that there was a fight on the farm. The rooster Sigvald was fighting with the bull Ferdy. As it turned out, a fight really did break out between the bull and the rooster. The bull wanted to knock down the bird with his horns, while the rooster jumped high into the air. He landed right on the bull's head and hit him with his wing with all his might. After that, taking advantage of his confusion, he landed right on his back. While the bull did not understand anything, the rooster began to peck him on the head with all his might. Finally, the main character intervened in this fight and ordered the animals to stop immediately. He grabbed them both and claimed that they belonged to him. He was the top dog on this farm. If any of these wild beasts touched the other with even a finger, he promised to roast them in the oven and eat them both. He stated that he would not tolerate any fighting on this farm. The animals seemed to have learned their lesson, but were clearly unhappy with being humiliated in this way. Then he told Ben that the animals would be good boys now that he had shown them who was the real boss. He explained that he told the animals that he would eat them if they fought. He then turned to Ellie, saying that he would meet with Sleep today to discuss the sale of the cheese, and then he would pick up a couple of things from Keller for the second barn. But suddenly Ellie interrupted him and said that she was thinking about leaving with the caravan today. At that moment, John froze. He was surprised and apparently clearly did not want the girl to leave. But deep down, he knew that it would probably be better if he was next to her. It would only make things worse for her. Therefore, he approved of her decision, but warned that if it was about the farm, then it was he who had to leave. He definitely had somewhere else to go. The girl immediately stopped him, saying that she didn't mean it that way. He could stay, since he had already invested so much in this place. But John said that he was leaving today, but still would not interfere if Ellie wanted to leave with the caravan. Finally, he said that he was very glad to meet her and asked the girl to take care of herself. Now Ellie was very depressed. She understood that this time it was a real separation. Soon after, the protagonist arrived at the saloon to meet his comrades. The bartender was already waiting for him inside, and Sheriff George was sitting behind the bar. The bartender asked how he was doing, but John said he had been better, although sales seemed to be on the rise. The bartender said that it was definitely not a good thing. They always get busy for a couple of days after a murder, and then business returns to normal. Then the hero offered him a deal to lift his spirits. He said that Ellie had worked on something special, and the bartender could sell this cheese. As soon as the man tasted it, he immediately remarked that the cheese was excellent, and he wanted to sell it at his hotel. Then the sheriff decided to apologize to the hero for accusing him of killing that guy from the class. But now he realized that John had nothing to do with it. He also said that sometimes he looks around the city and wonders who will be next, because you never know when you will see someone for the last time. In fact, this was what was weighing on the sheriff the most, and he didn't know how to deal with these feelings. When they found bodies in such a terrible state, no one could have been prepared for it, and even after that, it didn't get any easier. John said he felt the same way on the battlefield, and resigned when he could no longer bear the brutality. Then George said that he, too, could not wait for the moment when he could leave here with a clear conscience. But the main character was not sure that everything was so smooth, because when everything was just settling down, something bad suddenly happened. The sheriff said that was life, but asked John not to worry, and stated that he would still find his happiness. And then John realized that he was hinting that he had no choice at all. Meanwhile, Ellie stood in her room and had already packed several bags with her things. At that moment, Ben came to her, also holding in his hands the map that the main character had recently drawn. He looked at his older sister in surprise and asked why she had packed her things, and the girl began to talk about how it was not safe here. But the boy immediately objected. It had never been safe here. They were the last people in the city who could be killed, precisely because of John. The boy knew that he was planning to build Ellie her own room. His plans stated this. However, only now did Ben realize that this was a secret that should not be spilled. Now the girl realized that this was exactly what John had been spending all night long on. Ben said that now they would each have a separate room, and then all the workers would sleep in the bunker behind the barn. Ellie had no idea that John was planning something like this, but her brother said that John had a lot of such ideas in his head. Meanwhile, the protagonist came to Keller to finally complete the deal to transfer the farm to him. Afterwards, he asked the man how he was saying goodbye to the only home he had. Keller said that it was actually very simple, since he now had 25 gold. With that kind of money, everything would be much easier. Finally, the protagonist decided to give him a knife so that he could protect himself on the road. But he set one condition. He said that if Keller saw a boy with a young woman in this caravan, he should protect them too, because they were good people. Soon after, the protagonist returned to the farm, ready for another sleepless night building a barn. However, when he approached the pit, he saw that Ellie was there, who, as soon as she noticed John, immediately called him to her. The man was very surprised that they were still there and what they were doing there. Ellie said she wouldn't let John build the new barn alone, so they decided to help. They had to stay to make sure he was doing everything right. Ben boasted to John that he had finally learned how to hold a hammer, but the hero said that it was time for them to go to bed. Watching his brother and sister leave, John noted that even if it was harder, he was glad they stayed in the end. He then examined the foundation of the barn, noting that it was a real junkyard. It was no wonder the main building had collapsed. When morning came, the protagonist fell to the ground from exhaustion, and his doom point increased by 1. Now, in the middle of his own farm, John couldn't help but wonder when his life had become so simple and what lay ahead for him.